Arthur Holitscher, Journey Through Jewish Palestine, published 1922. Arthur Holitscher, 1869 to 1941, was a Hungarian-Jewish writer, journalist, and travel author. Born in Budapest, he spent much of his life in Germany. Holitscher wrote numerous travel reports and was known for his critical observations of social and political developments. Translation by Emal Gamsharik, 2025. A steep slope, massive, yellow, craggy rock face on the western shore of the Sea of Galilee. Here, legend says, is the place of the Sermon on the Mount. Our car drives along the road at the foot of the mountain, bumping over sharp stones by the lake's edge towards Capernaum. The road is new, gravel piles. Young men straddle these piles, hammering away at stones. Young women, bent over, shovel in hand, break and level the protruding stones on the road. As we pass, we whip off our hats. Shalom! The boys and girls wave back at us, returning the greeting of peace. They are our own. One last look back at the Mount of Beatitudes. Our eyes linger on the bright diminishing figures chopping stones at the foot of the massive barren slope. The legend, and there already lies Magdala, nestled against the water, kissed by the waves, 10 miserable Arab huts. Further ahead in deep green, the banana grove of the Jewish colony Migdal. Galilee, And on the road ascending from Tiberias towards Nazareth, they are breaking stones, our people. Up on the hills, angelic white among black cypresses, the Franciscan monastery rises towards the sky, the Greek church of Gabriel. Monasteries, delicate singing from the towers of contemplation. But below, in the white dust, under the burning sunlight, tap, tap, young Jewish boys, Jewish girls who have come from afar, build the roads of the land, leading to the monasteries of peaceful divine rest. In many places, in every part of Palestine, in Samaria, Judea, between Dan and Beersheba, in the north and south, they build the roads of their land Israel under the blazing sun. Where have you come from? What are you seeking here? Did you cross the sea to break stones? From the cities of Europe, from streets gleaming with electric light, from warm parental homes, from universities, teachers' colleges, to these harsh paths of the wild land, breaking stones for 8 hours and more under the blazing sun. Who are you? Who are these people? Looks follow us, friendly looks, sometimes smiling brightly. Shalom. That question, and again, what drove them here? Palestine offers 1,000 answers to this question. I have spoken with many young immigrants, old workers, long-time settlers about this question, with some intimately, privately. None gave me the same answer. Because only someone devoid of emotional life or independent thought, or someone who is afraid, would provide a stock answer to such deeply personal matters. But these young and older people, driven by an unconscious urge for the ancient land of their ancestors, Zion, are not ordinary folks, but people with a highly developed, very alert consciousness attuned to great matters, and they honestly and truthfully reckon what awaits them in Palestine and what they will have to accomplish there. Only about the nature, the essence, the mystery of their longing for Zion, for the land of Israel, they cannot provide a clear explanation. What is Zionism? Is it a religious movement? Is it the national movement of a dispersed people striving towards unity and seeking to reclaim this homeland taken from them 2,000 years ago? Is it the class movement of working Jews returning to the land, to the soil, to the fertile earth? Is it a metaphysical pull of a people towards a point on the globe where their destiny is to be fulfilled? Or is it an escape from pogroms, insults, an escape from the necessity of class struggle with all its horrors in the darkening exile homeland, which for some has perhaps become an exile, Galeth, 100-fold now? Is it a thirst for adventure that drives young people forward or calls them back to the ancient stony land? Is it weariness of the declining, all too slowly dying civilization of this doomed West? Nationalism. We are a nation. We are driven forward by the national consciousness of the Jewish people, the Jewish race. To which I replied, your history book is the Old Testament. The Torah scroll contains the history of your people. Which nation has another chronicle of its history that is proclaimed on holy days in houses of God? Your pull towards Palestine, which you call Erez Israel, is a religious drive, not a national one. To this, many responded to me, we are atheists. In such discussions, I might have made quicker progress if I had used the word messianism instead of the vague and misleading word religion, which has often been corrupted and degraded. There, at the foot of the Mount of Olives, opposite the Haram Wall, where the old temple once stood, lies a hidden wall of stones that remains. Countless Jewish graves line up the hill, where the trumpet of judgment and resurrection is said to sound one day. It won't awaken the thousands of Jews who willingly came from afar only to achieve the blessing of being buried there. Something of the madness of the Crusaders must be alive in all these Jewish settlers, pioneers, and workers of today, Shalusim of this new era. The desire to economically reclaim the ancestral land doesn't do justice to the immense drive to Palestine. It can only insufficiently explain the ongoing pull of Jews to Zion, to Erez Israel. Is a nation destroyed when deprived of its homeland? Jews exiled for millennia answer no, even if exterminated by sword and fire. 9/10 of the Armenians were swept off the earth, trampled, and destroyed by the Turks. Yet they still exist today. Their unbroken national will is evident in the unique strategies they continue to assert in the Middle East. Even if starved, politically, economically, or culturally crushed, not a trait of Austrians was broken in their catastrophe. Whether a people perishes in its land or lives scattered across foreign countries, its unbreakable essence remains. It sublimates in individuals. Even if deprived of recognition as a nation, even if the ground beneath them is pulled away, none of this changes their core. Nationalism is strong among peoples, especially in the East, where it appears in religious traditions. We believers in necessary class struggle, in human brotherhood, must understand this strong adversary more clearly than ever. We must see the powerful ancestral force we are up against. Jews didn't need, like Antiochus, contact with native soil to feel and assert themselves as a nation. They remained potent as a unit even in diaspora. Within their global scattering, they have stayed the salt of the earth, making humanity richer. They are the leaven of progress. Their spirited movement from Russia bears witness to their enduring presence, their swelling strength. Why don't Eastern Jews, full of this messianic ambition for the future, remain at home in an East that hardly seems exile anymore? Why not participate in the grand liberation project stemming from Russia, a slow, heroic transformation endeavoring to reshape the world? Instead, they push towards a nook of Asia, where their history paused 2,000 years ago, rather than where humanity's history begins anew today. If they were simply fleeing the necessity of struggle for a contemplative retreat, if they fled from the times, I wouldn't be writing this book. I'd scorn and curse such deserters and traitors. But the strong and faithful youth Palestine now welcomes, they build, falter, and err in the ancestral land, unhindered by failures, striving towards a new world. Just as in Eastern Europe, their exile home, as they struggle slowly through flaws and hardships, carving out a new home, a new Zion for humanity. Administration, colonization and building efforts, party formations, labor theories, worker organization, everything in Jewish Palestine still experiments. So too the problem of nationalism. In the diaspora, endless ink is spilled on this issue, yet clarity remains distant even in Palestine. The small Jewish minority in Palestine, this human selection of the best of today's Jewry, remains closely tied to the vast diaspora. The theorists of Zionism believe that the large number of Jews spread across the globe should justify the right of the comparatively small number of Jews that Palestine can accommodate to claim it as their homeland. However, it's actually the other way around. The young worker pioneers justify the Jewish presence worldwide through their sacrifices to their dream homeland in the ancestral desert. The ones arriving on the ships near the Jaffa coastline are not a people lost, oppressed, or wandering hopelessly across the earth. They are a self-reliant, confident, and strong group full of faith in the future, taking advantage of the British imperialism's declaration without much overt gratitude. The Balfour Declaration of November 2, 1917, promised the Jews a national home, and it certainly prompted Jews to return to the ancient land of promise. But what's happening in this old land, the Jewish takeover of Palestine, is driven by a higher will, with a broader perspective than the simple notion of homeland can encompass. 15 million Jews are scattered across the globe today. Out of these, 3 million reside in America and around 1.25 million in Soviet Russia. 8 million are Eastern Jews, Poles, Ukrainians, Romanians, Latvians, and so forth. Of these 8 million, as proven, half cannot provide for themselves adequately. They survive, if not on charity, then in the sheer horror of dire poverty, eking out a living in unproductive professions. It's these Eastern Jews who are sending the most robust, eager to work, and faithful pioneers to Palestine. The Holitscher is an Eastern Jew. This land of Palestine, this narrow, mountainous strip between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan, El Arish and Akko, 3 hours wide, 11 hours long, this slim strip of land in Palestine, covering 27,000 square kilometers, inhabited by 700,000 people, is a land systematically ravaged, deforested, left fallow, and depopulated over millennia by the Turks and Tamerlane. Today, it bears only stones. Block after block must the farmer dig out with his hands and harvest nothing but stones for years instead of bread. This swampy, fever-plagued land, wild, dangerous, abandoned, in summer overrun with intoxicating flowers that are merely weeds, an added burden for the worker in the fields and mountains, in winter inundated by rain showers that suddenly flood the dry riverbeds with torrents of rushing water. This wild, rocky, deserted land around Jerusalem, once Sharon, Canaan, the promised land of the desert wanderers, this harsh land that consumes, grinds down foot by foot heavy work, nourishing health, boundless willingness to sacrifice. It is today the homeland of the chosen from the Jewish people, who slowly stir it back to life, a testament to the present and future strength and resilience of the scattered nation. Welfare institutions, aid societies, alliances, and individuals of faith and wealth, like the Parisian Rothschild, enabled the first settlers to live in Palestine 70 and 40 years ago. These early colonists were predominantly students, young, weary of persecution and mistreatment, small-town folks buckling under the pains of their exile home. Theodor Herzl, the promoter and father of the new Zionism, the Zionist idea as it exists in the world today, died in 1904. He was a Hungarian Jew from Budapest, and his Zionism originated in Paris, where he composed delightful chats for an Austrian bourgeois newspaper. Herzl's Zionism doesn't date back to 1883, when the blood libel trial of Tisza Eslar occurred in his homeland, affecting mainly Hungary's impoverished Jewish proletariat, but from 1894, from the Dreyfus Affair, from the wave of anti-Semitism that then threatened the distinguished Jewish bourgeoisie through one of its most prominent members. Herzl's Zionism was a matter for the Jewish bourgeoisie. Today, the entire Jewish diaspora, or at least a significant part of it, is contributing to the fulfillment of the Zionist dream in the ancestral land. These, however, are the poorest, most destitute from Eastern Europe. The Zionism of today's Palestine concerns the Jewish proletariat, though, as I will explain, of a particular kind. I departed from Trieste on one of the magnificent express steamers of the Triester Lloyd on the day the Unknown Soldier Festival was celebrated. Garlanded trains traveled across Italy that day, bearing coffins to Rome, Aquileia. Inside lay broken limbs, rattling bones which once belonged to humans, unclaimed bodies unknown to anyone in the world, left mourned by none. As these tragic trains passed through stations, the local people fell to their knees by the tracks. Widows and orphans sobbed, flags waved in the breeze of the passing train. The grand, touching lie about the world's gratitude to those who sacrificed themselves for a fleeting cause drifted decorated and tear-stained across the land. From this ceremony that flooded the docks of Trieste, the ship Vienna set sail through the bay heading south. Down in the steerage, a small group of young people leaned against the railing. There were about 20, and as the ship pulled away from the pier, they sang. They sang the Hatikva, the song of hope, the national anthem of the Jews. I later went down and made friends among them. One young man immediately showed me his papers. 19 years old, a student at the Riga Conservatory, he'd already played in concerts, and a newspaper even had his photograph. His uncle, a clothing store owner in Chicago who earned $400 a week with a house and bank accounts, including $25,000 in Liberty bonds, had requested an exit permit for him from the Latvian government to go to America. All these financial details are required by the American immigration authorities. The family member you bring over shouldn't become a public burden. "I've got my passport," the young man said, "but I'm going to Eretz Israel, not America." You won't be living in a house with an elevator, but in a tent. You won't wear nice American clothes, but will start digging the earth. You might fall ill and grow tired from fever and excessive work. You'll miss Chicago terribly, I told him. You won't have much time for playing the violin. Your hands will get rough and stiff after a few months of handling the spade or guiding horses. What do I want in America? I'm going to Eretz Israel. He was a kibbutz. Even before the cliffs of Jaffa, where in the distance Mount Judea appeared before the veiled eyes of the immigrant, long before the Promised Land's coast, bitter Zion begins for those in the steerage. It was down in our ship, just a small group, about 20 young men and women. I later heard that about 80 people were held back in Trieste from sailing with the Vienna. Quarantine. This measure serves a method, a policy originating far from the field of hygiene. A large ship, the Carniolia, was refitted months ago by Lloyd for the mass transport of Palestinian immigrants. But a cue from the British government, following the May riots in Jaffa, halted these preparations. The danger of spreading diseases through Eastern Jewish kibbutzim is just an excuse. In reality, the British government wants to prevent a large influx of Jewish immigrants to Palestine. And they don't want too many coming from the Bolshevized East to Palestine either. That's why people's hair is shaved down there in steerage. They are held in ports, carried in cage-like wagons from one disinfection barrack to another. Their belongings are so thoroughly disinfected that they sometimes dissolve into their chemical components. They let them waste away to skeletons in the hospital in Alexandria or Port Said, bullied by Levantine port thugs like Sudanese. The authorities have 1,000 ways to slow down immigration, to scare off the immigrant. The Zionist executive, the Commission of Zionists abroad and in Palestine, know these methods very well. They also fight against them. However, I'm not sure how unwelcome they truly find them. Uncalled and unannounced, immigrants flow into Palestine through ports in Italy, the Levant, and the Black Sea. Most struggle and just manage to drag themselves to the next destination, the port city where their ship waits, and arrive penniless in Jaffa. Only a small fraction have relatives wealthy enough to pay for their passage. Already the disembarkation tax, just a few piastres for the newcomer, must be paid by the Zionist Commission to the boatman in Jaffa, in Haifa. The chalutz or the chalutza finds no piaster left in their empty pockets. A head tax of 1 Egyptian pound is imposed by the British government for each immigrant. This regulation, also enacted after the May uprising, is supposedly to calm the local Arab population. The Jews should cover their own living expenses, as the Arab taxpayer will not be made to support the newcomer. The Zionist Commission is under serious pressure. They're living hand to mouth and anxiously waiting for mail from America, for checks. Funding is needed for everything: disembarkation, landing fees, every tent where an immigrant temporarily stays, every bite they eat, every shoe, every shovel, every nail in a house, every piece of land bought or to be colonized. All of this needs money from countries with stable currencies, mainly America. Eastern Europe only contributes people. But where to find the money for head tax for those in steerage on the ships appearing on the horizon? Where to find the daily 12 piastres for food and shelter for the newcomers? If the money from America doesn't come through, the Commission is running around their offices in a panic. Unemployment looms. Last November, 1,200 new arrivals reached Jaffa and Haifa. The Commission secretly wishes it could, along with the British government and the Arab nationalists, call out, stop immigration, and motion to every port in the world, don't come over. We don't have money for you, and therefore no jobs. Stay where you are in the name of idealism. We don't know what to do with you. Wait, otherwise disaster strikes. Some say it already has. And in a louder voice, do you want us to eventually accept industrial capitalism to find you jobs? Do you, who were proletarians in the diaspora, want to be exploited in the Holy Land? Stop! But immigration can't be stopped. Through countless channels resistant to countermeasures, quarantine, illness, hunger, danger, and suffering, waves of young Jews, young Jewish women, flood eagerly into the land of Israel. According to verified statistics, 30,000 Jews leave Poland every month. Especially among American Jews, most of whom originate from Eastern Europe, there's a clamor. Where are these 30,000? Why can't you, meaning the Zionist organization, bring 50,000 or 100,000 to Palestine and settle them there? There's currently no way to reconcile the Jewish masses' need to emigrate from diaspora countries with the necessity of settling these masses in Palestine. Jewish immigration to Palestine is not only a necessity for global Jewry but also for Palestine itself. The local Arab population understands this necessity. They themselves haven't managed to rebuild and reforest the devastated land. The British government has no reason to deny this necessity either. Over all other complaints and accusations, the Zionist Commission hears this loud and clear. Why can't you, despite authorities and countermeasures, accommodate the growing demand from those in Eastern Europe to reach Zion? The necessity for immigration has been proven and acknowledged even by non-Jews. The circumstances in Palestine provide an answer: financial shortage. But in Europe and America, people have a different opinion. They claim the Zionist organization suffers from internal issues. In its current form, it's deemed unviable. Too much money is wasted on lavish offices in major diaspora cities, far too much on salaries of leading figures, on propaganda trips and such, hence why so little trickles down to Palestine, where so many hands are reaching out. The entire apparatus of the Zionist organization needs to be reorganized on a new basis, or else Zionism is in danger, and disaster will be unavoidable. The disaster. They've stared at the possibility of it happening in Palestine for too long. There they say, if only it would happen. The Jews of the world would remember their duty. We wouldn't freeze in horror at every ship's arrival, fearing the next day. If only the world knew we've long lived in the nightmare of daily disasters. The cliffs of Jaffa are not a metaphor. They're real cliffs, treacherous, jagged reefs that make landing ships and disembarking passengers impossible in rough seas. Then the ship must sail on to Haifa, but often it's only possible to disembark the immigrant in Beirut. In Haifa, I visited the kibbutzim house, where a new group of young Romanian and Ukrainian workers had just arrived. The large house was overflowing and could only accommodate 300 people. In the garden, which boasts a magnificent view of palm trees and agaves stretching out to the Bay of Acre and the distant blue mountains of Lebanon, tents had been set up to house another 100 people. A ferocious downpour had turned the ground beneath the tents into a muddy mess, soaking bedding, mattresses, and all the possessions of the residents. In the dining hall, which used to be a chapel, the young folks sat at tables. The first course of the meal was quinine. I walked past the tables with the representatives from the immigration office. What a remarkable group of people. Strong, cheerful, and courageous, filled with the spirit of adventure, the land of Israel, the fulfillment of dreams from childhood, and the anticipation of work that both their muscles and souls were eager to embrace. They were also feverish from the oppressive climate that challenges Europeans. Friends, comrades, my fellow kin, the Chalutz is only under the Zionist Commission's care for 3 to 5 weeks. After that, they must fend for themselves. Both in Jaffa and Haifa, as well as in Jerusalem, newcomers are registered by the Histadrut alongside the immigration office. Histadrut is a cooperative union and employment service for worker parties, spreading them across the land to places and into trades that need workers, including agriculture, urban jobs, and road construction. The path a Chalutz takes to reach their dream job in agriculture can be long and painful, and not everyone makes it through without wear and tear on their body and soul. Most begin with road construction, draining swamps, house building, and various forms of construction work collectively known as black labor, chornaja robota, for good reasons. The tough stone breaking, bricklaying, and building under the blazing sun, standing knee-deep in swamps, are not what the young workers want or are physically suited for. These are relief works, and for road construction, they are not funded by the Zionist Commission, but allocated by the British government. The hardship is often justified with the saying, all work in the land, from the toughest to the easiest, must be done by our own. None can be refused if we want to conquer the land completely, but it is sheer necessity that drives the young men and women to wield their hammers on the scorching roads. In Tel Aviv, I saw a chemistry student leading 3 camels loaded with sandbags. Cheerfully, the Chalutz walked behind the camels. This was white work. The Quish Road drains the Chalutz's muscles and nerves, the only treasure left once the Commission withdraws its protective hand. Their idealism, their love for the ancestral land. Eventually, they work not out of love for Eretz Israel, but to avoid hunger or begging. The journey to the land, the soil, is long, very long. I spent memorable hours with some of these black labor groups. There is one on the Haifa Gemma Road, named after its Bulgarian leader and well known throughout the country. It comprises about 40 young men and 3 or 4 young women, representing many European nations and all parties of the Palestinian labor force. This group has roamed the land for years, building roads and houses sometimes in Galilee, sometimes somewhere in the south. They seem to have developed a liking for this type of work and the freedom of movement it entails. Some, whom I spoke with in detail, wanted nothing to do with the deeply desired settlement on land and soil. They preferred to go from quish to quish. They earn 40 piastres daily, a lot, even by Palestinian standards. However, for food, lodging, and other expenses, they had to pay 20 piastres daily to the organization. But they managed to live well within the group. Some had bandaged hands, others suffered from malaria, but since it was Saturday, they ate well, even had Rishon Lezian's sweet wine on the tables, socialized, and sang before heading down to the beach for a soccer game. I encountered comrades who provided me with valuable insights into the work structure and group life. Throughout my travels in Palestine, my previous year's journey to Soviet Russia influenced me heavily. I often had more to report than what was told to me. By the end of the year, the roadwork was to end, and the group hoped to find employment in building houses in Tiberias or Jerusalem. If the Commission has the money for these constructions by then. I visited another equally bold and lively group one Friday evening, all the way on the other side of Palestine, in Beersheba. They were building the cemetery wall around the graves of British soldiers. Allenby won the decisive battle near Beersheba. These young people seemed content with their lives and loved their work too. The wall was nearly finished, and they didn't know where the next job would lead the whole group with their tents, whether they'd stay together or go their separate ways. But it was Friday evening, and they ate, drank, tea this time, smoked, and listened to a talk about Soviet Russia. Suddenly, one of the happiest among them sat next to me and asked, "Can you tell us what will become of us?" "We don't know. Will we get work or will we be left to starve?" In the distance, others sang. It sounded beautiful in the tent by the cemetery. "One thing we all know, we're staying in the land. None of us plans to go back. Come what may." That was Beersheba. In another group on the road to Gemma, a young German sat next to me while others drank and sang a merry chorus. He looked me in the eyes and said, "We sing, we have wine, we have work, and we live day to day. But don't look inside us to see what it's like. We can't see anything ahead." Soon after, the whole group was up on their feet because the general was driving over their unfinished road. More on that later. In a swamp near the colony of Hulda in the Judean hills, on the road from Jerusalem to Jaffa, I came across young Hungarians working on concrete constructions. There were 14 young people from Budapest, some graduates of technical schools, educated and intelligent boys aged 20 to 27, weighed down by their hard labor, malaria, bandaged hands, tattered clothes, mud-soaked, leaky boots. They felt neglected and assumed they'd been given overly hard work because they weren't quite part of the colony's community. The others spoke Hebrew, they didn't, and even Yiddish wasn't a common language for them. Plus, food was sparse, probably to cut down the deficit. The Hungarians grumbled and kept to themselves. I asked them, like everyone else, "What brought you here? You're from Horthy's land with its death squads. You know about pogroms, massacres of people and ideas. But are you just refugees? Or was there something else that drew you from the sophisticated city to this swampy stone desert?" They admitted it was idealism that brought them, these intellectual, demanding young people, to Palestine. "Each of us," said the group's leader, "was driven here by idealism. But as soon as you set foot in Jaffa, you look around. Where's the idealism gone? Probably washed away. The struggle for survival has begun, a terrible fight with reality. Anyone still babbling about Zionism ideals after a month, well, we'd laugh in their face. Actor. These are surely exceptions. But there's a fact I need to report. It's not to be ignored. It should be heard by the world. When in Jewish prayer houses the rabbi, in his black-striped shroud, towers over the congregation, and the words of invocation and exhortation fill the air, the crowd's heads bow in shivering reverence, and they immerse themselves in God. What I must say should begin with words that form both an invocation and a plea to humanity and destiny. On the road between Jaffa and Jerusalem, away from the main thoroughfare, near the town of Lud, the ancient Lydda, stands the large central British military camp. A group of Scottish soldiers came towards us. After morning exercises in the blazing tropical sun, they had settled in comfortably, their fair and red chests gleaming. They had 2 bagpipers leading their group, puffing out Bonnie Dundee with full cheeks. The lads marched joyfully onwards, shouting something to us in our car. Not far from this road was the place where, under the supervision of armed British soldiers, a dark group was said to be laboring by the road. A dark group, the renowned road-building crew of Lud. I heard more from various sources about this team by Lud. Here, Egyptian fellahin worked alongside our shalutzim. It's tough work. Is it the road, the air, the swamps? There's a lot of desertion happening there. The British military authorities have ordered road workers to be branded to prevent these desertions, which threaten road construction. Before work starts and during breaks, these men have to squat down, apparently to be better monitored. I once saw a group of such Palestinian laborers squatting at a station, just like cattle, around 60 of them. 2 Tommies were calmly smoking their pipes at both ends of the herd, with bayonets on their rifles. The stamp is pressed onto their bare shoulder. Neither sweat nor water can wash it off. Even months later, a runaway can be identified by this stamp and brought back, probably to prison. Since our pioneers have volunteered for this emergency work, it's only natural that they too get stamped. The English government prefers to use the intelligent pioneer rather than the lazy and indifferent local laborer. But the democratic principle of the English character, so notably clear in the Orient, doesn't allow even the smallest difference in treating native and immigrant workers in the same group. On the road from Lud, at the famous Lud Junction, our people work with a stamp on their shoulder. They work to build the land with their labor, to conquer Erez Israel by our work, any work. After all, it's the Jewish homeland, the land that belonged to them 2,000 years ago, the land Moses led the Jewish people to after 40 years in the desert, out of Mizraim, out of slavery. Our people are in good spirits on the highway near Lud. They have work. Listen, Israel. In many kibbutzim, among the young workers, both men and women, since these groups include young women doing the same hard labor as the men, there's a growing restlessness, except for a few who find some satisfaction in this hard, unbound life. Most kibbutzim workers want to be freed from their current jobs soon. They demand land they can settle on and cultivate. Thousands wait in the kibbutzim waiting to be settled. It was promised to them. Many were already farm workers in Poland and Ukraine. Many have been trained at agricultural schools and with farmers in Germany. Large stretches of land, though still rocky and not sufficiently drained, in the most fertile parts of Palestine, the Jezreel Valley, the Upper Jordan area, Sharon, in the mountains of Samaria, Judea, have already been purchased by the Jewish National Fund. Why don't they give us this land? The impatient ones complain. Now, in the rainy autumn season, when weeks of wild downpours prevent road work and work in the swamps, crowds of unemployed kibbutzim workers, black market laborers, gather at the doors of the Zionist Commission offices in Jerusalem, Tel Aviv. Hungry and rebellious, they shout, "Land! Give us land! We want to cultivate it! You've bought enough land. Why do you have money to buy land, that is, for the effendi or the patriarch you buy it from, but not enough for colonization, that is, for us? You buy too much land and colonize too little. It lies fallow and we are left to break stones on the roads or loiter hungry in the cities. You're better merchants than colonizers. Buying and bargaining brings you more joy than the care for the detail work of colonization." They probably don't know, or only a few of them know, that even these great land purchases have been made with small down payments, with insufficient funds. And they can learn from the delegates of various small and large, nearby and remote settlements, who wait with them at the doors, how difficult it is to extract even the necessary funds for pressing work from the Commission. How valuable labor lies idle for weeks during such waiting and uncertainty in Jerusalem, in Tel Aviv. How the enforced stay of the delegates in the cities, the expensive train fares, eat away at the meager funds of the struggling settlements. I spoke in Jerusalem with Ushishkin, the top man of the Zionist executive in Palestine, about the unrest among the pioneers on the Quish, doing the black work. A man of significant intelligence, unlimited energy, relentless and deeply committed to his task, which he will defend and carry out to the bitter end. At the Carlsbad Congress just a few weeks ago, the executive defined their policy like this: "We need to bring and settle as many pioneers as possible in Palestine to counterbalance the Arab majority. Out of the 700,000 inhabitants of Palestine, only 70,000 are Jews." Now the crowds of immigrants are coming into the country. Well, it's not exactly a stream, and we know why. But those who are already here find out that land is being bought up while they're stuck loitering in Jaffa and Jerusalem unless they turn to illegal work. Understandably, these exhausted or frustrated people are shouting, "Your land purchase is a bluff. Why buy so much land if you don't have enough money to develop it?" The level-headed and sensible man from the executive responds, "These complaints cannot be considered. Accusations like these don't affect us. If we don't buy land today, we miss out on a great opportunity. The effendi and the clergy are driving prices up, and we would be left figuring out how to establish a foothold here. We must spend everything we have on land purchases. Without land, Zionism is nothing but a soap bubble. We're not deceivers. We don't create illusions of things that don't exist. Anyone who still has to break stones to live is marked for settlement. The older ones are at the top of the list, and the newest arrivals must be patient. If someone loses patience, courage, and nerves, this land cannot support them. We are fighting. Everyone must recognize that we are doing our best." But the pioneer whose work on the quarry has ended takes off his boots, packs the few books he brought to Palestine in his second shirt, if he still has such a thing, slings shoes, book, and shirt over his shoulder, and marches barefoot and hungry over makeshift roads to Jerusalem or Jaffa, figuring out how to scrape by. I am a poor pioneer from Poland. I walk in boots, boots without soles. The essence of this book, everything I aim to express about Palestine, centers around these conditions: the nature, the possibilities, and the living conditions of the pioneers. I tried to investigate and now try to depict how their work and their work theories stand, what resides in their hearts and minds, what they signify for Palestine, for Jews worldwide, for humanity and humanity's future. Everything I have to say lies in this sphere. Pioneer. It is the central, overwhelmingly important question of Zionism, but it's also one of the most significant issues of the great universal socio-religious movement of this era. Pioneer means trailblazer. It may not just be the land of Palestine these pioneers are preparing. The parties of Jewish workers in the diaspora find their continuation, or rather their roots, in the socialist societies of the Palestinian labor force. The right wing of Poale Zion, Workers of Zion, corresponds in Palestine, roughly, to Achdut Havoda, Unity of Labor. The community organization Hapol Hazair, Federation of Young Workers, and Zere Zion, Young Zion, from diaspora parties correlates in Palestine, roughly, to the slightly more radical Hapol Hazair. The left, openly communist wing of Poale Zion, Vienna direction, which has now applied for membership in the Third International, corresponds in Palestine to the, after the May pogroms, persecuted by the English government, decimated, now working illegally party of Borochovs, named after the founder of the World Poale Zion, the significant Russian socialist theoretician and Hebraist, also known, somewhat dismissively, as Mopsi. From the initial letters of their official name, Mifleget Poalim Zionistim Irim. When I don't need to say more about this latter party that it's roughly corresponding to its European organization, it means they have a very clear program, namely Moscow, and also that all the other Palestinian parties, due to the geographical distance, but not only because of it, significantly deviate from the diaspora organizations. The Borochovs, their number is extremely small, fundamentally reject any participation in public and governmental activities. Through active and passive resistance, they commit to fighting against English power, which, as Moscow emphasizes, aims to turn Palestine into an English colony. When the Borokaus engage in activities that are generally opposed, they do so with the thought that there must be cells created and an attempt made to organize Jewish and Arab workers together. During the railway construction in Haifa, they experienced a complete failure in this endeavor. It's clear that the idea of incorporating the completely undeveloped Arab worker in such a primitive way won't work. The Borokaus also emphasize that industrial capitalism will have to be introduced into Palestine, and in its most extreme, American form, so that the definitive proletarianization of the Jewish worker in the Holy Land pushes him to the level of and into close association with the lower, exploited Arab rural proletarian. Only then, argue the Borokaus, can an organizational union between the Jewish immigrant and the native, currently still hostile, rural population be achieved. Otherwise, they believe, and I must say rightly so, from the standpoint of consistent Marxism, the Palestine problem is unsolvable. They see more clearly than anyone else the catastrophe, both economic and racial conflicts, that will erupt in the land if this last phase, the capitalization of Palestine, which today's sentiments oppose, does not happen soon. The Borokaus hold a very pessimistic view of the current situation in Palestine. They see no way out of what they call the crisis of Palestinian Zionism, yet they express a determination that despite all hopelessness, the overall work in Palestine must be maintained at all costs, for there's no turning back. I'm now moving on to discuss the approximate nature of other parties in Palestine. The worker parties in Palestine look quite different from those in the diaspora. One might be tempted to say that Palestine doesn't really suit the party system. The parties in Palestine don't reflect reality. They're merely atavistic memories of the fragmentation of Western humanity in the old world, which is disintegrating. If you ask about the specific direction or program of this or that party, or the distance between them and neighboring parties on the right or left, you won't get a satisfactory answer. Essentially, the contours of the Palestinian parties blur. Individual personalities, leaders of groups, are more influential in shaping and defining the nature of the parties than programs imported or adopted from Europe. It's like this. Here in the ancestral land, a group of workers has come together to build a wild homeland and its future in a super-personal community. The light over Zion lifts the shadow of the party, so that despite all the differentiation of tendencies and personalities, there is a united phalanx of workers at Zion. That's why I can imagine outbreaks of despair from pioneers in Tel Aviv or Jerusalem today, but not a strike. That's why there's no 8-hour day in Palestinian agriculture. That's why, although there are people of highest intelligence gathered in Palestine, rebels against any mechanization of the work process, i.e. of the working individual, I would support the introduction of the tailor system without warning, because these workers are about their idea, their illusion of Eretz Israel. Well, the ingrained Russian ghetto indolence, broad-natured laziness, yielding nerves add enough damage to Palestine's work even without active sabotage. But it's also Russian that in Palestine, ultimately, there are as many parties as there are workers. Everyone has their theory of work, their own, their groups, the communities. In the diaspora, they interpreted the holy books. In Palestine, Marx. Palestine, I repeat, is still in the experimental stage. For this experiment, work provides the most fertile ground, especially the colonization work. I've been to about 20 settlements, worker groups, and colonies in Palestine. I have seen the land, the soil of the plains and the mountains, in its wild primeval state, in the stage of the first preparations for cultivation, and also in its maturity and triumph. In 20 places, I've seen people perform the hardest physical labor by the sweat of their brows. But the curse of the lost paradise didn't weigh on this work, because I've heard these same people a few days later at the Agricultural Workers' Congress in Haifa present and defend their work methods, theories, and discoveries with full energy and compelling conviction. In Palestine, every method of working reflects in the way the community is formed, affecting each other significantly. This gave me a clearer understanding of both Palestine and the meaning of our times since I met the people of this region. The social and colonial movement of young workers is heading in two directions. One aims for large cooperative groups known as kuza, which is about big communities working together. The other is the moshao audim, or workers' settlements, where small family groups closely work together, each managing their own piece of land independently. The large cooperative operates under communist principles, centralizing various professions for joint production and consumption. The settlement cooperative, based more on private ownership, somewhat resembles the utopian ideal of an anarchistic federation of neighbor groups living freely together over a large area. In current-day Palestine, two types of agriculture are set to prevail. 1. The extensive type of the large cooperative. 2. The intensive type that only small groups can manage. There are many arguments in favor of the latter. Practical ones, for instance. Crops like sorghum, sesame, or different vegetables, particularly eggplants, which are a nutritious food, thrive better under intensive farming. Small livestock farming, beekeeping, and silkworm cultivation need a small-scale approach. Plus, organizing work becomes easier here since summer and winter work requires roughly the same number of workers. On the other hand, extensive farming requires extra help during harvest time, leaving many kuza workers idle in winter. The large collective, however, is driven by the spirit of this age, moving from private ownership to socialism, and shifting from small family units to large cooperatives, where private property becomes communal. Older workers, especially those married, tend to back the workers' settlements, but young post-war immigrants are passionate supporters of the large kuza, the communist community. The young chalus, pioneers, having witnessed the failure of traditional economic systems in the Old World, come to Palestine not to recreate that dying system, but to live true to their social principles. They willingly devote themselves to this land, where they can live by their convictions. The Zionist Commission wisely allows the chalus to forge their own path. Critics might grumble that the Commission leans sharply left. Yet, anyone familiar with the situation understands that the chalus' dedication and enthusiasm for their work are crucial assets for the Palestinian economy. The Zionist Commission has given both the large kuza and the Moscow Audim expansive areas of the Jewish National Fund to pursue their plans. They're located in the fertile Jezreel Valley of Lower Galilee, known as Nuris and Malul. These are where Palestine's major social experiments take place. Funded by donations from philanthropically minded Zionists in the diaspora, with only a minority coming from contributions by Jewish workers' parties worldwide. This creates a complex and troubling question for a sincere, deep-thinking socialist when faced with it. Can you support this kind of socialism? Should you speak up for it? Or would it be better if this source of private charity dried up, leading to a potential collapse of Jewish Palestine? Are the comrades correct with there is no going back? Or is there still a way back? When a socialist visits Palestine, what catches their interest most is the innovative concept of the Geduth Havoda, or the Labor Army. It's a radical group based on Russian principles, fundamentally rooted in communism. This organization combines elements of both labor and military, encouraging its members to work and train in self-defense under strict discipline. The idea for Guth originated from a Russian Jewish legionnaire named Joseph Trumpeldor, considered a martyr of early Palestinian colonization. Trumpeldor lost his life 2 years ago defending the small Upper Galilean settlement of Tel Hai from Bedouin raiders. Trumpeldor's journey led him from Russian prisons to freedom through the revolution. He fought as a captain in the British Zion Mule Corps, served at numerous fronts, and entered Jerusalem with General Allenby. In Palestine, you can see Trumpeldor's image everywhere, whether in tents, barracks, or stone houses. His picture often appeared more frequently than those of Weizmann, the president, or Herzl, the founder of the World Zionist Organization, especially in places where workers gathered. The intellectual leader, pioneer, and apostle of today's Geduth is the young Russian Jew, Yehuda Kopelowitz, a friend and fellow prisoner of Trumpeldor. In the settlement of Nuris, which serves as the center of this effort, Geduth members work in organized battalions on lands provided by the Jewish National Fund. They also take on roadwork assignments from the British government in construction, drainage, and planting projects assigned by both the commission and settlers. The guiding principle is that the community must produce everything it needs in its own workshops, starting with clothing and shoes and later agricultural tools and more. Income and expenses from collective work are centralized. The Guth assigns its members to whatever work is necessary and of interest, including accepting Arab members who agree with its core principles and are willing to adhere to its discipline. After a month-long trial period, the executive committee grants membership approval to individuals within local groups. These groups send delegates to the central body, which in turn elects the executive committee. Beyond distributing work among members, the central body satisfies the cultural needs required for the struggles of life, providing libraries, lectures, education, film screenings, and more. If a local group's results are unsatisfactory, the Central Council can disband it and redistribute its members among other groups. Every Duth member is also required to train and excel in weaponry for community defense. The application form a new member fills out asks not only about their agricultural, craft, or artistic experience, but also about their military or medical service. Through this transition from community work to necessary defense, the Duth aims to create a moral form of militarism. With leaders like Kopelevich and the acknowledged organizer Lefkowitz from Ukraine, the Duth already boasts a large membership, gaining more respect among young workers daily. Through their example of work and their moral perspective on the Great Group Challenge, they're likely to influence worker organizations across Palestine. I've heard they're already unifying wage rates throughout Palestine. For us outside Palestine, the Guth is significant because it pursues similar goals as Trotsky's Labor Army from the disbanding formations of the Red Army, though they start from opposite ends. Whether such radical centralization can direct all of Palestine's labor remains to be seen. Yet as the moves toward centralization might self-defeat, a proposal by Delegate Ben Gurion at the Haifa Congress demonstrated this. Ben Gurion, though undoubtedly creative, with a less-than-pleasant commissar flavor, called for all organized in the Duth to show unconditional obedience to central directives, a kind of Egypt with tariffs. The Congress simply moved on without discussion of the outrageous proposal. You'll often notice that in Palestine, otherwise reasonable theories can take fiery and exaggerated forms. In such situations, the Commission faces a tough challenge. However, life's practical needs, gaining insight into the land's actual circumstances, and understanding the development conditions inherent in people often lead these fiery young radicals to become more flexible. It's as if the Commission and the young workers meet each other halfway, and this helps advance the work. After all, it's all about this work alone. Here's a snippet of a conversation I had with Kopelevich in front of the Agricultural Museum in Jerusalem. I said, "What kind of communists are you?" Just like the old Chalukya folks here who lived off the donations of pious benefactors, like the old colonists once sustained themselves with funds from the French alliances, the German Aid Society, and millions from Baron Rothschild, you are building your communism on the contributions of American capitalists to a fundamentally bourgeois organization, the Zionist Commission. You're like Chalukya communists. In other countries, communism seizes capitalism that's already present. You expropriate American capitalists bit by bit, depending on the mail, the goodwill, or the P. We don't want to know what happens with our money. Of the American Zionists, Kopelevich responded, "Capitalism must give us the chance to live communistically." The Jewish Agricultural Museum in Jerusalem, a creation by Jacob Ettinger, the head of Zionist colonization efforts, showcases samples of all that can be wrested from Palestine's rocky soil: grains, fruits, trees, along with the land's stone and animal species in exemplary clarity and completeness. Ancient scripts, legends, and chronicler Flavius Josephus talk of the land's magnificent forests, gardens, waving fields, and lush meadows. But where have they gone? Where is Canaan, Mamre, the holy grove of Tabor? It's stone, rock, and swamp everywhere. Here and there, a wild patch of undergrowth, fragile roots chewed and destroyed by goat herds, a few olive trees grouped together, tree plantations surrounded by tall, thorny cactus hedges, and small grain plots of Arab farmers. Scattered across the land, on mountains, in plains, in oasis-like patches, there are isolated green areas, eucalyptus groves, and vineyards of Jewish settlers and colonists. While traveling to Jaffa, I boarded a small ship called Murano from the Trieste Lloyd in Port Said. We were delayed by a day and a half because we had to load planks. The writing on the planks said, "Orange crates for Jaffa." The wood came from Austria, which means there are no forests in Palestine. Austria's Styria region must supply the wood for orange crates. The land lacks coal, oil, iron, and even stones that would be useful for building are not found in great supply. In Tel Aviv, they're setting up a silicate brick factory because the stone around Jaffa is too porous. The colonies that have existed for over 40 years still need to import frozen meat from Australia, eggs, butter, rice, potatoes, even tomatoes from Egypt. Yet in Cairo and Alexandria, just a day's journey from Jaffa's orange groves, one can find oranges from California and Florida at fruit vendors. What are these long-standing colonies producing after 40 years? In Baron Rothschild's cellars in Rishon LeZion, there sits the heavy, sweet wine of Palestine. Exports are stagnant. America has gone dry. The Egyptian pound, the currency here, is strong. The world is impoverished. The Jew primarily shops in bazaars for food in towns and cities from Arab merchants, but the Arab does not purchase from the Jew. Arabs tend to be self-sufficient. They thresh grain with old methods, reminiscent of Samson tied to the millstone alongside the ox. Their food consists of flatbread, melons, and coffee. Their tents are simple mats on poles, their drinking vessels made of hairless goat skin. If the Arabs live in villages, their huts are of clay, dissolving into muddy puddles with 2 consecutive days of rain. The climate here solves the housing issue for the Arabs in the simplest way. Shelter is only necessary for about 30 days a year. A handful of effendis, wealthy established families, own land that the National Fund needs for colonization. The effendi lets his impoverished tenant or worker cultivate only a small part of this land, leaving most of it fallow. If a man sells his land, the gentleman heads to Cairo, ideally without his wives, and lives the good life there. Hard work can extract everything needed from the land to sustain large populations in terms of food, clothing, and all other necessities of life. In many of the 20 settlements I've visited in the Judean mountains, the alluvial plains near Transjordan, south of the Sea of Galilee, and in the Jezreel Valley, new trees are sprouting, grains are germinating, and the fruits of the legendary lost Canaan are maturing once again. Jewish agriculture in Palestine must primarily strive to meet the needs of the Jewish population in the land. I accompanied Jacob Ettinger on an inspection tour through Galilean settlements. An agronomist and socialist, he knows the land and the people, acting not just as an advisor, but as a friend to the workers who trust him and whom he helps. In Palestine, you meet people of a wonderfully pure and genuine nature. I've met many in the Zionist Commission. Their work often resolves the sometimes stifling discord that arises from the juxtaposition, Shalut's, executive. Ettinger had the specific task of examining settlements whose yields didn't meet the Commission's expectations for structural issues, fixing them through technical means, in the worst-case scenario, dissolving them, and explaining this necessity to the settlers. We visited settlements where mixed farming work, planting, and cattle ranching were to be introduced. There were often deep personal matters concerning the settlers' private lives to discuss. Women needed to be brought in who understood vegetable farming and small livestock. Settlers needed to be made aware that starting families was necessary to stabilize the small settlement, as the comings and goings of single comrades, who only worked there for a short time before trying elsewhere, sapped the farm of any development potential. In other settlements, the personal safety of the small number of workers, isolated in the wild, was threatened by Bedouin tribes from the surrounding mountains. Such settlements needed reinforcement or relocation. Often this was also necessary for the intensification of work with a larger workforce. Discussing such matters wasn't without heartache. Our path also led us to settlements where we only needed to hear reports, wishes, and suggestions from the settlers. We repeatedly stayed in the 2 renowned settlements of Kinnereth and Degania, which are in many respects characteristic of the overall settlement problem in Palestine. Degania was founded 12 years ago by the Jewish Colonization Association on Jordan Valley land, and was handed over to a workers' cooperative that lives and works there by a distinctly communist principle, works successfully, and lives in exemplary harmony. For several years, it has been able to repay half of its profits to the National Fund, thus amortizing the sums invested by the Commission in land, houses, and equipment. The land area of this settlement is slightly over 3,000 dunams. A dunam equals 900 square meters. Degania's success prompted the Commission to purchase another large stretch of land in the Jordan Valley so that other small farms, Degania Bet and Degania Jamel, have been established at miles-long intervals from the original settlement, now known as Degania Aleph. Degania Aleph boasts a stone house, large stables, and a beautiful garden with blooming orange and almond trees. Where there were swamps around the settlement, now stands a huge grove of eucalyptus trees. The workers of Degania are now building a bridge over the arm of the Jordan that flows past the settlement from the Sea of Galilee. In this well-managed and thriving settlement of about 50 workers, including 5 families, there's even a kindergarten with 6 children born in Degania. Such a close-knit community of shared purpose and effort has developed that the social-religious principle of communism seems to have grown organically from the ground like a strong tree providing shade to people and land. The happy harmony among the mostly young people enhances the economic conditions. The workers are well coordinated in their division of labor, and migration is rare, and the group's reputation attracts additions from the best and most capable elements of the Palestinian workforce. Yet, this ideal state carries a considerable risk. The fact that people were able to pay off an honor debt to the Commission through their work is already a driving force of private capitalist ambition. This lifts the settlement above others and separates it from the majority of Jewish settlements in the country, which generally struggle and operate at a loss. One could say that in settlements that are self-sustaining and work without deficits, a rather individualistic view of the community problem and the ownership of land can quickly develop. Such specifically Palestinian contradictions, a mix of small group communism with a touch of private capitalism, are encountered often today. It's called the Malul principle. Nuris was established to combat this, aiming for the Gduth, the army of labor. In Degania Gimel, a half-hour drive from Aleph, 12 young people have settled. I know that my repeated visits to this small settlement in the vast wilderness of the Transjordan Valley will remain long in my memory. These 12 young people, Ukrainians and Russians, including 4 women, have independently cultivated, plowed, and planted the vast area of their settlement. The joy in being together, working collectively, and sharing responsibility was evident in the cleanliness and coziness of their small primitive wooden huts, which housed their bedrooms, the tool shed, the dining and reading room where our meeting took place. Of the 12, only 6, 4 men, 2 women, came inside to meet us, while the others stayed outside working, even though the day was ending and they knew Ettinger's visit was very important to their interests. We were served tea and cake. As the discussions began, I looked around the small barrack. I found a small library, its composition quite telling, similar to what I've seen in many huts and tents. Hebrew books, mostly about agriculture and chemistry, translations of modern Scandinavian authors, originals by Ahad Ham, and German books like Freud's psychoanalytic writings, a volume by Nietzsche, a volume by Tagore, Freud and Marx, the essential literature of the Kaluz library. Often there were books and pamphlets by Hans Bleuer, many German and Austrian Chalutzim from the Wandervogel, the Free German, and the Blau-Weiß movement asked me about Bleuer, his new writings, and his changes of heart. Outside, around the small settlement, there was a trench, made by the book and under the supervision of English officers. The young people of Degania Gimel were well aware of the constant danger they faced both during the day, while behind the plow, and at night, while walking around their huts with rifles on their backs. The Arab tribes in the mountains of Transjordan. And yet they were only 12. But they resisted. They stood firm. They did not want to dissolve or merge with the larger Degania Beth. They wanted to stay with their land, which out here, far from the others, needed them. They cultivated their piece of land, a large, expansive area requiring much care, and were jointly responsible for it. If they were moved away, it would fall into decay. Here in the wilderness, they were at home, even near those mountain tribes. For a year now, they had defended, with plow and gun, the land that had been entrusted to them for cultivation. It was theirs. There was federated cooperation with Beth and Aleph through the connection of the three Deganioth. But they wanted to find ways and methods to intensify their work, make it stronger and more consistent, to maintain their small community as it was, without having to integrate into another group. Here I saw the rootedness of the young Chaluts with the ancestral land. Here I witnessed a touching example of the kind of independence the land, the idea, and faith had developed in these people, descended from exile, persecuted, oppressed, and homeless. Crusaders, Puritans from the Rock of Plymouth, had gone out to establish a kingdom of God through work in the wilderness, surrounded by hostile tribes. But these weren't zealots. They were children of peace, not stubborn fanatical sectarians, but joyful sons and daughters of a new era. They make sacrifices with every breath, every new morning that finds them still alive in the vulnerable wilderness. Offering sacrifices, hard work, deprivation, physical hardship, and breakdown, filled with glorious hope, they build the altar of the third temple on the plains of Eretz Israel. Many joyful, happy people live, young and strong, under the sun of the ancient rocky homeland. I watched these young, hard-working people sitting around our table. They were talking with the leader of their work, who was also their friend. They spoke seriously and quietly, but were deeply stirred about the most significant questions concerning their land, their work, and their existence. They were the purest, most beautiful young people I have ever seen. High on a mountain, on a plateau wrested from rocky terrain above the settlement of Kinneret, at the southwest end of the Sea of Galilee, lived 25 young men and women workers. Battling the storm winds that rush over from the deep gorges of the Jordan Valley and the mountains of Gilead, they build terraces from stones they dig out, carry over, and stack as protective walls for the olive and almond trees, as well as grapevines and fig trees they plan to plant there. For 8 months, they've lived in wind-swept barracks, fighting against stones, wind, and the treacherous soil's challenges, laboring for the success of their work. This, too, was a happy and cheerful group. Up there, they were spared from the marsh fever, refreshed by the wind and cool air, and content with their lives. Instructors should come here, mixed farming should be introduced, new settlers should come to expand and strengthen the colony. There was agreement at Mountain Kinneret on all this, but down below, in the old Kinneret, the renowned old settlement of Galilee, the oldest by the Sea of Galilee, we looked into troubled faces. This colony isn't thriving as it should. Kinneret's land covers 6,500 dunams. There are stone houses, large productive vegetable plantations surround them, and there was even a training farm for girls. The farm with its buildings offers opportunities for mixed agriculture under favorable conditions. Yet there's a constant coming and going in this colony, restlessness and a lack of cohesion that hinders and sometimes completely disrupts the work. Are they facing internal issues, incompatible temperaments, and characters that make this colony a problem child of Palestine? Many of the original settlers are gone. The new ones, together with the old residents, can't establish the form, the inner cohesion necessary to influence and define all external economic forms of existence. Such tragic discord can destroy all favorable conditions, rule out possibilities of repair through external means and methods. Earnest work is wasted. The land might yield what and as much as it can, but the settlement wilts. It's as if every group, every colony has its guardian spirit or demon. The most capable and self-sacrificing people become weak here, give up, sometimes even their lives. The deprivations imposed by the work are not joyfully borne, as every individual feels burdened. The question looms, does this community justify such a burden? Many young people flee from these communities back to the lands of exile from where they came, and there they falter. Those who remain are burdened with despair. During my travels through the colonies and settlements of Palestine, I have encountered many tragedies of this kind. They are living, very alert, and sensitive people who work in today's Palestine, and their destinies are often challenging to direct. It takes the full humanity and wisdom of men like Edinger and the builders of Palestine, Dr. Arthur Ruppin, to provide advice and help here. In neighboring successful Dagania, the old worker Gordon, a respected patriarch of the socialist movement, lives and writes poetry. Did he think of the fate of the colony across the lake when he rewrote this Ukrainian song? On the little riverbank a fire is burning, but the heart is cold, for the old ones have long been dead and the young ones old. I often heard this melancholy tune sung on Friday and Saturday evenings in tents and barracks. In many places, by young workers, young girls, fresh voices, and tired ones too. All these colonies, settlements, new and old, are under continual oversight by the Commission. This has its advantages and disadvantages. In the settlements, whether they are communist in nature or more private capitalist, the workers and settlers know that the Commission covers any deficits with its resources. This can lead to two kinds of demoralization. Why make the effort? The Commission will make up for the losses. But the opposite might also happen. After years of struggle, a group might continue to operate at a loss because they have to spend relatively large sums on work that isn't directly productive, like draining swamps or planting young trees that won't bear fruit for 4 to 5 years. But mainly it's because they don't receive enough money from the cash-strapped Commission for urgent purchases, which hinders their most important tasks. Once they realize their efforts aren't bearing fruit, it becomes easy to fall into fatigue, indifference, or a laissez-faire attitude, and without the Commission's intervention, the operation might fail. This encompasses the tedious waiting by comrades, waiting weeks at the Commission's gate in Jerusalem for funds. There's also penny pinching in the wrong places, and a rushed settlement of worker families on poorly drained swamps. The settlement where I found the Hungarians was 12 years old, yet the swamp was still not regulated. In Hedera, 3 generations of colonists had to die of malaria. Instead of promptly and generously draining swampy areas at once, the process is slow, taking years, even as planting and building proceed, much to the detriment of lives and energy, a fault in organization I've heard many complaints about. On the other hand, I once went with Dr. Ruppin and Ettinger to a small settlement near the sea, south of Jaffa. We entered the house of the settler's spokesperson, a lovely home with a well-maintained chicken coop run by his wife, which was quite impressive. The husband, living and working there for 10 years, had successfully cultivated his allotted land, sent his kids to school in nearby Rishon LeZion, but soon expressed a request. He wanted the Commission to buy him 2 cows to expand his farm. This raised the question, where else in the world does a farmer, after 10 years of living on his land and achieving prosperity, turn to a Commission to gift him cows? If he can't buy them himself, or obtain them through a credit union, he simply has to farm without cows. Meanwhile, in the Jewish city of Tel Aviv, someone shared a story about a wealthy homeowner who earned £60 monthly from rent. But whenever a window pane needed replacing, he'd run to Baron Rothschild's office to have the Baron gift him the pane. He had received his small property from the Baron's charitable organizations 40 years ago, and the habit of begging remained with him. At the Agricultural Workers' Congress in Haifa, which I already mentioned, a main discussion point was the transition from subsidies to loans. There was also talk of a workers' bank that would provide loans independent of the Zionist Commission. Thus, the economic security of work in Palestine is entering a new phase. At this Congress, there was much talk about individual responsibility towards the community and the community's collective responsibility toward the land. The term slaves of the land was mentioned. But it turned out that the land, which they had come to cultivate and renew, had inspired and fertilized these hard-working people's intellects. The close bond of the Zion pilgrim with the beloved homeland soil gave rise to strangely beautiful spiritual blossoms. Often, speeches were filled with pathos, forgetting the given limitations and daily hardships, mixing enthusiastic plans with theories drawn from experience. There was uncertainty whether this would benefit or harm the practical feasibility of both. Worldviews clashed, met, and fought in the realm of ideas, high above the mundane reality. So it was with the worldviews, Malul and Nuris, the Moshav Ovdim and the Gedud Havoda. Nevertheless, both have already shown visible outcomes, becoming reality, albeit just outlines of living, viable entities. During our journey through the Jezreel Valley, we stopped at a tent camp called Malul, and lingered in another called Nuris. A few words about Malul. In this settlement, led intellectually by Eliezer Joff, 80 families are currently housed in tents. Each family wants 100 dunams of land for independent cultivation, but will initially only receive 50. The remaining 50 will be settled over 5 years, once it's proven that a family can successfully manage more than 50 dunams of land. When settling these people, we want to avoid the mistake the Jewish Colonization Society once made by giving settlers too much land, which led to wasted effort and neglect of the fields. The settlers of Malul, some of whom are older folks, lease land from the National Fund and annually give 2% of the initial land price back to the fund. The land is good for farming, but this area of the plain has been struck by fever, so the settlers' women and children had to be moved to the highlands of Nazareth. Nuris is situated further southeast in the Jezreel Valley, near the Afula station on the Haifa-Damascus Railway. Ancient names come to mind. It's the Valley of Armageddon, known for huge battles. Sunem hides in the foothills of the Gilboa Range, which is part of Bashan, Og's kingdom. Here, from a deep rock cave, springs the Goliath source. Its waters go through the Nuris area, over a swampy and inconsistent terrain. 6 rows of tents stand before this spring. 120 people live there now, but an additional 300 will soon join them. People from the Dude, around 60 families, a group from Hashomer Hatzair, the Young Guard of Palestine, and the famous communist kibbutzim of German and Czech-Slovak intellectuals from Shefsiba near Hadera. The 120, most of them under 30, men and women, Russians, Germans, workers, and former students, including a Christian who is an old carpenter, have only recently settled here. Many do not know each other well yet. Their community is still mostly based on principles. Few are married. The 60 families I mentioned earlier will be settled across the railway on the healthier hillside. Between the Goliath Spring and those distant hills lies the Nuris area, a vast, endless field bordered by mountains. At the spring, young girls wash clothes for the 120. In stylish shoes and tight skirts brought over from Lodz, Odessa, or Munich, they carefully navigate the sharp stones, kneel in dry spots, and beat shirts and trousers with broad paddles. In the stream flowing from the cave into the swamp, on the edges of the random watercourse, on the path leading from the tents to the railway embankment, young men stand, waist-deep and naked, with spades, their skin bronzed by the bright sun. Up ahead, near the swamp, women use large spades to dig out massive rocks from the ground, pulling up deep roots and collecting them all into baskets they then carry away. I approach a young girl struggling with one of these heavy baskets. She is from Vienna, a philosophy student. Far away at the edge of the field by the railway, an American gas motor operates slowly on the cleared, black, fertile land. I've heard a young girl, a member of that New York club of young Jewish women who donated the plow, works in the settlement. Once the money was all gathered and the plow bought, they rented a hall in the Bronx, decoratively adorned the plow in the center, and the club danced the foxtrot around it. Now the celebrated machine rumbles loudly across the field. I've been told their reunion was touching. A towering young man sits aboard, while behind the tractor the earth rises in mighty clumps. Far away, so distant that you can't see it, but still within Nuris territory, a second tractor is at work. In a few days, the work will be finished. The girls on the stone-strewn fields and the boys in the swamp are working with every muscle. A car comes across the fields. 3 young men with rifles get out. This is the self-defense, maintained collectively by the scattered settlers of the Jezreel Valley. The car travels from settlement to settlement, connecting them and offering a sense of safety. But there are other guardians of the settlements. A cowboy, a striking young man in a khaki shirt, a rough rider's hat and leather pants, makes his rounds around Nuris on a fine horse. We greet him as he gallops past us, and we call out to him, "Shalom." He carries a good rifle over his shoulder, wearing a bandolier across his chest. His horse is of noble stock, and he rides with a loose rein. In the heat of midday, he's up there on the hill above the Goliath Spring, where the stone houses of the Arab residents who were moved stand. When the land was bought from the Effendi, they also acquired new land at the other end of the valley for the Arab workers who had to leave Nuris. They'll have better conditions at their new home and place of work, good land which they'll receive under favorable terms. In front of the houses they're soon to leave, a few Arab workers sit in their cloaks, smoking and watching the life unfolding at the foot of the hill, around the spring, in front of the tents, and across the swampy field. They're women, with silver bracelets on their brown wrists, blue tattoos on their chins, and eyes lined with kohl, stand beside them. The land now belongs to the Jews. They stand and sit, colorfully dressed, motionless. They gaze down at the group of young people, dressed in white and light yellow, scattered across the sun-drenched plain, working, breaking stones, carrying. The Arabs plow around the stones, filling in the old swamp, building a road, weeding, going in and out of the tents where sewing machines hum, typewriters click, where there's hammering, cooking, ironing. In their colorful clothes and silent, the Arabs and their women watch the bustling life and unfamiliar people below. Slowly and thoughtfully, the young cowboy with his rifle and ammunition rides around the silent group of Arabs. Gun, rider, and horse have merged into one under the sun's glare. This is the Shomer, the guard, a descendant of those who once, under Joshua's command, went to conquer the land from the Goliath spring to defeat the Philistines thousands of years ago. At this spring, Joshua tested his warriors before the march. He let them drink from the spring. Those who lapped the water with their tongues like dogs were dismissed. Only those who drank with full mouths were allowed to remain in the army. Slowly and thoughtfully, the young Shomer rides past the Arabs, then spurs his horse and races down to the tents. A deep trench encircles the tents. It's deeper and more skillfully built than the one around Dagania Gimel. The trench around Nuris has trenches and connecting trenches. Not even a chicken could hop over it. It's wide and deep. At one point, dug man-deep into the earth and bomb-proof with sandbags, there is a field hospital. I jump into the trench, open the door to the room. 4 clean, ready-to-use beds with snow-white covers, a cabinet with medical supplies. The 120 belong to the dude. They're all skilled with weapons, many having fought in the World War. In the Jewish Legion, at the Dardanelles, the Suez Canal, in Palestine with Trumpeldor, defending Jewish colonies years ago in Galilee, this spring in Jaffa, at Hadera, at Petah Tikva, just weeks ago in Jerusalem. Even the Hashomer Hatzair and the Chef Siba folks, the 2 most politically radical groups in Palestine, are tough guys. These strong and enthusiastic young people, whose willingness to sacrifice is proven, are to be stationed in the danger-prone area of Nuris, which is most threatened by malaria and most easily surprised by aggressive Arab tribes from the surrounding hills. They will defend Nuris. They won't attack, but neither are they pacifists or voluntary martyrs. They are weapon-savvy defenders of their land, their community. They defend not only their own, but the life of their idea. Their leader is a Tartar mountain Jew. He's long been a settler and policeman in the valley. With a revolver and whip in his belt, he walks back and forth between the tents and the Arab hill. The Arabs know who he is. They look down at him. He looks up at them. They know each other. This is Nuris, the home of the Jewish labor army. Before the war, there were Jewish agricultural colonies in Russia near Poltava, Yekaterinoslav, Kherson, Odessa, Homel villages with purely Jewish farming populations. Despite immense pressure and persecution from a corrupt government and bureaucracy, these settlements persisted and even thrived. During the war, they were destroyed. Many Shalutzim come from these Russian colonies, having been farmers before coming to Palestine. Others were gardeners, blacksmiths, carpenters, mechanics, tailors, and hat makers, small traders, accountants, printers, watchmakers. Then there are teachers among them, doctors, writers, musicians, many students, from all the big cities of Germany, Austria, Czechoslovakia, and from countless corners of small towns and villages in Eastern Europe and the Balkans. They all came together, farmers, workers, intellectuals, driven by the same urge, returning to their ancient homeland. But more than that, perhaps unknowingly, they felt an urge to leave behind the shame and failures of a collapsed civilization with a fresh start. They wanted to escape from decay, from lies, and step forward into the land that required enormous sacrifices to rebuild. Just as the land, culturally lagging behind the modern world by millennia, demands a full commitment from the individuals, so does the form of community these young people, farmers, workers, and intellectuals are striving for, a community that leaves behind the outdated forms of today's societies. Many think they are following the faith of their ancestors. Others believe it is their faith in future generations that leads them to Palestine. Some believe in a utopia, but all believe in the purity of their will and their sacrifice. Yet, there's a profound mistake at the heart of what's happening today in Palestine. The young intellectuals, workers, farmers from eastern and western lands live now in Palestine, closely working together, living the hard life of rural laborers. However, this proletariat does not represent a class like in the countries of exile, but rather a uniformly proletarianized ghetto, separated from its surroundings. They voluntarily became proletarians for their country, but they remained amongst themselves. A ghetto wall rises around their community. Did they escape from exile to avoid the necessity of class struggle, or to avoid the need to mingle with non-Jews in a large class? This same question makes Jewish workers, parties in exile, such problematic entities. This is the question the Borochovs try to solve by advocating for the joint proletarianization of Jews, Bedouins, and Fellahin. Have the pioneers not yet discovered the class? Or do they want, through their sacrifice for the land and their community, to create a new form of class from within themselves, one that wouldn't need other classes for its triumph? One strong enough to tear down the ghetto walls that separate classes along with their own? There's another deeply ambiguous error or contradiction in the economic principle of Palestinian communism. In a remarkable study by Comrade Nir about the kibbutzot in Palestine, I find the following sentences. Among the Jewish workers in Palestine, a peculiar, naive idea of socialism developed. Not the socialization of the means of production is considered as the main demand of socialism, but rather the elimination of the owner. They see socialism as a way to be personally honest, not to exploit and not to be exploited. From a socialist standpoint, it is not essential who the current owner of the land is, whether it's the National Fund or the older Jewish colonization company, nor how the inventory is acquired. The main issue is the method of distribution of the labor product. The kibbutzot are in reality private economies, just belonging to a group of owners rather than an individual. And Nir adds, our whole further work must continue vigorously in the sense of founding new cooperatives. All existing cooperatives must be connected within an organizational framework, which will form the state apparatus in the future, and at the right moment, take control of everything in the country. Well, the Gadud is a step on this path, and the distance from Russia's agrarian communism to Zionist Palestine is determined by the extent of sacrifice. The supervision of the group or settlement's work is the responsibility of the community. They oversee the work, as well as all forms of organization and maintenance of the group's community. Evenings and half of the nights are spent in tents and barracks, discussing the most crucial issues of external and internal life, necessities, and conditions. It is the atmosphere and environment of revolutionary Russia. Here, as there, intellectuals cooperate with practical workers, supporting each other, understanding their shared fate. From such cooperation, particularly capable and insightful comrades derive their strength to lead the entire group. But in the end, it is just the collective voice rising from each individual comrade. In particularly radical groups, individuals don't receive specific powers such as traveling to Jerusalem, negotiating with commission members, or attending conferences. This contrasts with less politically advanced groups. In these radical circles, the Soviet system has been passed over for a free anarchistic model where only the community as a whole, in the true sense of the word, has the right to oversee its own well-being. Yet, even in groups like these, there's a friendly way of recognizing the most capable and committed individuals whose proposals yield strong practical results. It's amazing how intelligent these young people are, and the way they express both their work methods and the sort of transcendental theories of their spiritual community from which their work arises is impressive. Some ironists might say that in Palestine, nighttime chatting over tea and cigarettes came before the actual work in the fields. I've once remarked that every farmer I met had his marks open in front of him while he plowed with his right hand. But in Palestine, anyone suggesting the appointment of a supervisor from above, like from the commission, over the work groups would not fare well. This kind of setup isn't just known in the Orient, where often there's someone with a stick standing idly by while three locals work, but also in so-called civilized countries, where he's referred to as a speed boss. In Palestine, faith, reflection, and the stark necessity shape every aspect of work and living together. Occasionally, you meet people in Palestine with an aura of leadership, seen only by those who sense, know, and love. I've become close to some of these distinguished individuals and gotten to understand the beauty of their nature, which is pure sacrifice. These aren't the top officials everyone knows and acknowledges, but are rather often obscure individuals, released from Russian prisons or Siberia through the revolution. Sometimes they are highly educated with refined culture. They are surrounded by admiration. The clarity of their being, capable of endless dedication, extends its influence over the souls and destinies of companions and the fate of the land, often against their will. When young people mention their names, a foreigner's memory might recall figures from the Old Testament and the one unjustly called the New. The biblical poor man, the crucified man, and the traveler to Emmaus, resurrected for humanity, is encountered unexpectedly by the foreigner, the seeker, at a bend in the road, under a dark archway, in the cities and wilderness of Jewish Palestine, in a splendid human form. Years ago, during a textile workers' strike in Lawrence, Massachusetts, young girls carried a banner reading, "We want bread and roses too." More than once, these touching words came to mind when I met young women in Palestine. These young women, both married and single, mostly from educated middle-class backgrounds, including teachers and students, but not many laborers, come to Palestine. For the single ones, dissatisfaction with their profession or environment may often be a motive for emigration. They take on the hardest work with great enthusiasm, driven by the feeling that the same urge brought them to Palestine as their male comrades, and thus they must participate in their tasks. Yet the stones are hard, the sun is hot, the baskets are heavy, and the days are long. Many of these young women soon collapse, sometimes hopelessly, with lifelong abdominal diseases. Even vegetable farming, weeding, tending fields, fruit picking, and tasks considered lighter turn out, over time, to be too taxing for delicate systems. Only in a few settlements is work like mixed farming, beekeeping, and small livestock keeping introduced. The Commission is now focusing on encouraging these young women to carry out domestic work, like washing, cooking, and sewing, in street workers' tents, settlements, and colonies, and even in private homes in big cities, and to move away from tasks that demand men's strength. There are and have been farms for girls in Lower and Upper Galilee, and an excellent educator, Mrs. Shokshat, has set up a home economics school for young women in Jaffa. The young women who are faced with such a demand feel deeply unhappy. Isn't this servant work they are being asked to do? Did they give up their intellectual careers just to cook, wash, and sew? Only in settlements where there is good understanding between the men and women does the work naturally and effectively divide, with women doing tasks that suit their nature and abilities. But in older settlements, and generally those where mixed farm work is done or children live, women gladly carry out all kinds of necessary work, which often significantly contributes to the prosperity of the entire group. The shortage of women is a serious obstacle to Palestinian colonization efforts. Also, the sexual aspect plays a harmful role in communities where there are many men and few women. However, this issue is generally resolved reasonably and more easily in these communities, thanks to the healthy lifestyle and high ethical social standards of the young people, than outsiders might expect. The effects of hypersexuality as a consequence of war cause more damage in corrupt cities than in these settlements, where hard physical work is done everywhere. For the English, Arabs, Christians, and others of different faiths, which I will discuss later, it's shocking to think about what might happen in those camps, where 30 or 40 young men and 5 or 6 young women live together peacefully for weeks and months. Sometimes there's an opportunity to clarify to the morally outraged that these same young men and women used to cram together in Ukrainian ghetto basements for weeks and months while pogroms raged above, to teach them about the strength of the human spirit and to alleviate their fears. However, the living arrangements of young married or engaged couples with single lonely men often disturb not only the couples, but also the single men. Some sad fates conclude quietly, away from view, far from the tents, in night, solitude, and despair. Most marriages in settlements and farms are conducted with refreshing simplicity, without excessive ceremony, without civil registrar or church authority, cheerful and godly. From a letter that friends shared with me, "I'm really sorry you didn't receive my last letter, in which I reported the recent happenings. Now you know, I got married the day before New Year's. I'm sorry I didn't tell you anything. I mean, it's not really your concern. The poor one involved is just Jay, but in a way it does concern you because it turned into a major celebration. I, of course, knew nothing beforehand, but I'll tell you everything as it happened. You know, Jay was sick. On the day he was taken to the hospital, it was confirmed that he had typhus, and so he was in the hospital for 14 days. That the thought matured into action for both of us is something that is quite understandable according to Freud's psychoanalysis. While I haven't read it in Freud, Jay and I found it very understandable. Now, he came home the Thursday before New Year. On the Saturday before New Year, G came, and on Sunday morning Jay went to G and said, 'What do you think about me getting married?' Well, this is a real treat for our comrades. Even though we didn't want a celebration, the entire Jordan Valley was immediately turned upside down. A mounted messenger was sent from kibbutz to kibbutz, and so a wedding took place. Of course, I worked until evening, doing a symbolic task. I washed diapers for the kindergarten with Jay, who was already wearing his wedding uniform, helping me. If my mother had seen it, Jesus Christ, washing on my wedding day, and so on. In the morning, when the news spread, I worked on my vegetables. Jay's brother found out and came with the pitchfork. On the way to the barn, he rushed towards me, embraced me, and shouted his Mazel Tov, congratulations. Then I put on my wedding attire and was all set for the ceremony. Meanwhile, the dining hall was being decorated festively, with J.E. really going all out. When the two of us entered the hall, we were greeted with cheers. Naturally, I followed my old habit and went to my usual spot next to Shiksh, but was led back with laughter. "You should be sitting next to the groom." I had completely forgotten that. The room was filled with a joyful atmosphere, everyone's faces shining, all smiling at us with love and sincerity. Suddenly, from behind us, the children presented us with flowers, while little Sarah offered a beautifully pronounced congratulation. Silence fell again, along with a serious mood. Then, quietly, glasses were filled. G, our dear old G, stood up and blessed us, not with the usual traditional blessing that rabbis give, but with a few warm, heartfelt words that showed his struggle to express such big feelings. Spoke as well and began his address with the words, "This touched on a wound that won't heal, the founder's death." Then the dancing began. The widow of X's founder took part in a celebration for the first time since her husband's death, and as we danced in the circle, it grew smaller until it was just Jay and I. CH joined us, in her black dress, dancing to the song, "Everything is Good and Beautiful." She sang and danced, her song turning into sobbing tears as CJ's brother left the circle, crying loudly. It became too overwhelming for me, and I ran out of the room in tears. Now it's all over. I heard of weddings where the couple exchanged kisses under a proper chuppah, canopy. The canopy was a tablecloth supported by 4 rifles, from which 40 shots were fired into the night sky after the ceremony. The couple would move into their own tent or room, but life in the kibbutz didn't change much. Communal meals, where settlers and workers dine, are generally well provided. People eat plentifully in tents and barracks. In some groups, life is so communal that clothes aren't owned by those wearing them, and letters remain unposted for weeks, because money is so disliked that they can't spare a piester for postage. Yet food is excellent everywhere, enough for visitors to enjoy the hospitality, if they didn't feel uneasy while chewing. Where else are there farmers or workers who smoke incessantly even when standing in the mud? In many kibbutzim, housing and food costs almost equal the workers' wages. Germans and Americans demand the least from the kitchen and cellar. Galicians, sons of small traders and craftsmen, Hungarians even more so. There's plenty of sugar for tea and coffee everywhere. Cigarettes too. A major concern of the Commission: how could the daily food costs, up to 15 piastres per person in some settlements or road construction groups, be reduced to 8 or 6? We often arrived by chance at lunchtime, sometimes at dinner time in some kibbutz or quish of Galilee or Judea, partaking in a common meal of vegetable or milk soup, rice, potatoes, meat, in small amounts, compote, coffee, and plenty of good quality bread. In Jerusalem, I ate an excellent lunch for 9 piastres at a worker's kitchen. The Tel Aviv worker's kitchen offers chicken or steak for lunch even on weekdays. If you ask the owner if such a menu isn't too extravagant, given that ordinary workers eat there, whose pay and job opportunities leave much to be desired, you get a huffy reply, but they're balabatish children, meaning children of landowners, genteel people's children. The kitchen expenses, since nearly everything needs to be imported except for some vegetables, flour, and milk, swallow huge sums and significantly increase the group's deficits. The guest also drains the group's thin resources and adds to its deficit. The guest is a charming but somewhat risky presence in the communal settlements of today's Palestine. On holidays, and even during the week, hundreds of young workers are on the move. They visit neighboring settlements, sometimes distant ones, kibbutzim, and city groups. They are warmly welcomed everywhere, given free lodging and meals. This generous and open-hearted interpretation of the communist community idea results in famous and frequently visited settlements like Kinneret and Degania, where each resident comrade has to pay 2 to 3 pounds a month for guests. Every suggestion to have visitors contribute to their stay costs has so far been rejected by the comrades in the settlements who do not want to abandon their communist principles. This leads to some inconveniences for the settlers. Take, for instance, the professional visitor, the work-shy and freeloader, this character also well known from Russian literature, who moves from farm to farm and lives carefree days among the workers as a tent mate and fellow eater. Occasionally, hosts come up with amusing ideas to hint to an overly persistent guest that it might be best for them to move on. That's what happened recently at a kibbutz with a wandering singer. While he stood there, singing non-stop after work one evening, the young men sneaked into the stable, drove their 4 mules into the barracks, lined them up in front of the bard, and slipped away into the night behind this patient audience. So, the practice of walkers continues, to the annoyance of the committee, despite the careful weighing of income and expenses of each group and settlement throughout the land. It's not something that can be arbitrarily curbed or stopped. It is a living part of the communally minded and economically operating community. Visits that are sometimes quite comical are paid to the kibbutz occasionally by the so-called Jewish Mission. This Protestant organization, funded by English, American, and German sources, particularly targets the mysterious road workers who appear to be in great need of conversion. A sincere Swabian pastor from Haifa tirelessly moves from kibbutz to kibbutz on Friday evenings and Saturdays. He sits kindly and attentively among the young people, concerned for their souls, and they listen to him tactfully and with interest. After hours of enthusiastic conversation, when he departs, he might ask the Shalotzim if he had managed to make a Christian out of any among them. Then, one Shalotz blessed with particular wit might turn the question back on the well-meaning pastor. Had their discussion perhaps succeeded in making the pastor a Christian? Listen, singing and dancing tunes. After a day's labor, by nightfall, the light filters from tents glowing softly, from barracks windows shining brightly, reaching far into the silent plain, over the resting lake, the cliffs standing tall. Outside, at the edge of the trench, the fresh wall around the settlement's perimeter, the guard makes his rounds with his gun. He hums the melody secretly, but his ear is sharp, and his eyes stay watchful. His feet don't tap the rhythm of the dance in the tent, in the barracks hall. In strong marching steps, they circle the settlement he protects. From the connectedness of the young people in settlements and tents of the ancient land, bound in work, responsibility, life together, danger and love, new and strange folk poetry has sprouted. Beautiful, all too rare, too brief evenings spent with you, young people, how short, how rare. Greetings, friends, to you over there. I could not understand your Hebrew songs, but you sang them, and as I watched you, my heart resonated with their rhythms and understood their meaning without words. And now, in still young memory, a sequence of sounds links to the sacred landscape. The dark, jagged gate, with memories of sacred community under the crescent moon floating like a ship on a deep sea of stars in the east. Not many of these new Chalit's poems have been recorded yet. The ones known are spread orally, especially by those walkers who carry them from their place of origin to a distant evening table. Thus they find their way from north to south, from valley to mountain. Every person brought with them a song, a tune, a dance from their Galut homeland, from Lithuania, Poland, Little Russia, from the ghetto, from synagogues, from Hasidic circles. I heard it wildly and desperately, with an accusing tone, the song of the old rabbi who faces the rulers of this world as they oppress him, with words from the Bible and calls to God and the prophets. That eerie passage, Isaiah 5, about the barren vineyard, the vineyard of the Lord Almighty is the house of Israel, and the men of Judah his delightful planting. He expected justice, but behold oppression, righteousness, but behold a cry of distress. They sing it after a hard day's work, after tough battles against enemies. They sing the immortal words to a strangely stirring Hasidic tune. There are also many cheerful songs, mostly joyous songs celebrating the happiness of the community and the pleasure of living among brothers. But it is Jewish cheerfulness. The heavy, burdened soul distorts the rhythm, and even through the cheeriest songs, you can hear the deeply sad undertone of protest against the overpowering fate that has oppressed the people for millennia. It's precisely that complaint of Isaiah, the haunting why. Isn't that lament present even in the exuberant song of Rabbi Elimelech, who, when he became joyful, called out for the two cymbal players? I hope to come across Remele the Melamed in the collection that the young poet Bistritsky now wants to publish. And the verses of the Old Gordon, one of which I've already copied, deserve readers in the old country and new lands around. But who can describe it? The feverish, frenzied Hasidic rapture that seizes the community when the songs have carried heart and mind far enough away from meaning and reality. Then they are just words and names that ignite the soul, leading it quickly to dance, spinning into dissolution. Just words of memory, mere hints of deep, inexplicable, incomprehensible things. Of love and devotion to this land, to one's neighbor, the community, to an earthly, blessed redemption. With closed eyes, head tossed back, body swaying in painful ecstasy, they cry out, Ajaj Galilee, Ajaj Galilee, Ajaj Kinneret, Ajaj Kinneret. And Carmel, Hermon, the landscape, and the people living there and those left behind who continue to live there. They call out to the stony land, and within the land, to the mysterious, alluring God, the unknown one whose call they've followed. Singing and dancing in almost pagan delight, the rhythm of praise swells through the night, a wild psalter, a service of worship through tone and movement. Ayaya Galilee, Ayaya Carmel. And it may be that the stranger, the guest, trembles as a thrill of profound, inexpressible feelings stirs awake within them. Ayaya Carmel, Ayaya Carmel. The Hebrew Gymnasium in Tel Aviv stands with its impressive stucco facade at the end of Herzl Street, across from the immigration office. Director Dr. Mossenson, a man of many merits, takes me from lecture hall to lecture hall. Then there is a break, and we stay up in the gallery from where you can look out over the garden around the sprawling building, the streets, and the surrounding houses. You can even peek into the windows of the immigration office from our vantage point. Down in the garden, the students are bustling around. They are children and young people of all ages, from those in short pants to those going through voice changes. Most of them are children of settled Tel Aviv citizens. Also colonists from the old, revered places of Rishon LeZion, Petah Tikva, Zikron Yaakov, south and north of Jaffa. They represent something like a growing, self-assured Jewish bourgeoisie. They are, so to speak, the second generation, the third, even the fourth. They already have ancestors. Meanwhile, those out there by the fence, the young men and women pressing on the street in front of the immigration office, are people of today, just arrived, tent dwellers, so to speak, nomads, in any case strangers, not to say intruders. The children happily make noise in the garden. Beyond the fence, pioneers and pioneer women clamor for work. They besiege the office. Up there, the capable young Gordon has his hands full with them. The children look through the fence at those standing on the street, but those on the street don't have time to look through the fence. In their yellow shirts, broad cowboy hats, they stand there, and their chatter rises loudly, overpowering the children's noise. They know those are the pioneers. They are the pioneer women. On the plains, on the mountains, today here, tomorrow there, they will lead a life under the sun, ride, drive carriages, in the evenings walk arm in arm along the streets, sing and dance. They watch them, the children, those over there in their khaki shirts. Over there beyond the fence, that's where freedom begins. Director Mossenson complains, "How am I supposed to maintain discipline among my students? Without discipline, I can't run a school, and without discipline, I can't raise capable individuals. You wouldn't believe the damage this romanticism over there causes among my students." He says romanticism with a certain emphasis. He's speaking of the same rubashka romanticism, which means the romanticism of those wearing Russian shirts, a real thorn in the side for those Englishmen, Arabs, Christians, and non-believers, whom I will soon discuss. It's a world of its own over there, behind the fence, a world in which I've spent the last 2 months. They're young people too, many just barely out of school. They've thrown away the advantages along with the prejudices of the bourgeoisie, still confined to the cultivated areas around the school. Should we strip the children of their belief that those beyond the fence are the romantic ideal figures of their youth, that living in freedom, striving in labor, facing danger, and being body to body with destiny are the ultimate goals? Maybe children only understand the part of this life that represents freedom and carefree living, and maybe some children can't see past the outer garment, the rubashka. But time keeps moving forward, encircling and tearing down this school fence, as well as the bourgeois ghetto wall around Tel Aviv. And it gets trickier when young and older workers romanticize the lives of their comrades in settlements, casting them in a dramatic light. When some element from outside or within stirs up a bit of self-satisfaction like, "Aren't we something special?" I too am not free of blame. I've tried line by line to avoid exaggeration, to show people and circumstances as they are. Yet here and there, as I wrote this report, despite my self-discipline, I was carried away by what I experienced and felt in Palestine, even now from this distance, swept up by it, and yet I'm old enough to know better. I told you about the young Chaluts from Riga, whom I met on the trip from Trieste to Alexandria on the Vienna. I met his counterpart, so to speak, on the journey from Tel Aviv to Cairo on the day I left Palestine. In the train speeding through the Sinai Desert towards the Suez Canal, a young man sat next to me. 25 years old, a mechanic from Haifa, assigned the task of taking over a machine in Kantara at the Egyptian border. An intelligent and good-looking fellow, the son of Russian Jewish parents who had come to the land 30 years ago. He was born in Haifa, a student of the technical trade school in his hometown, later learning from a master from the German colony at the foot of Mount Carmel, who gave him a solid education in his craft. The young man loved his profession and his land. He had no connections with the Chalutzim. He knew about them, had met some, but lived in a solid stone house with his parents, leading a well-ordered middle-class life and earning a good income from his trade. We talked about Palestine, then about Germany. He had never left Palestine. Suddenly he pulled out a few postcards from his pocket, depicting sculptures. I must say they were fairly mediocre sculptures, modern French ones, a female nude, an allegorical group. This was his great sorrow. He felt he had the talent to be a sculptor. But there is no art school in Palestine. I've never seen a real sculpture. No one could teach him art. The Bezalel Art School in Jerusalem only makes arts and crafts, following ancient traditional forms for the use of wealthy travelers. There aren't even models in Palestine, the young mechanic lamented. I told him, "You earn a lot, live with your parents, and don't have any expensive habits to maintain. Can't you save £100 over 2 or 3 years and study for a year at an art school in Berlin or Munich?" He replied, £100? Do you think I could bear going to Europe with £100 in my pocket when so many young people here are hungry? I thought that upon leaving Tel Aviv I could finally draw a line under my experiences in Palestine, but I only did so in Kantara. The state of education in Jewish Palestine is not good. What is more important, a threshing machine or a library? A pump or a teacher? I remember the debates at the Carlsbad Zionist Congress about expanding the Jerusalem Library. In the Holy City, I also witnessed the struggles of the librarian, my esteemed friend Dr. Bergman. But today, I want to talk about how there seems to be little to no funding for education in both small and larger settlements. The settlers are grappling with important questions. How should the children in these settlements be educated? Who should teach them and oversee their upbringing? There still isn't a clear answer to these pressing questions. Some settlements are still new and have few children, but what will happen when more children need schooling? There is a children's village, Kfar Galeadi, but it's really an orphanage for children of legionnaires and guards who fell in battles against the Arabs. Places like Degania A have kindergartens where women take turns watching over the kids. Larger settlements can afford to hire a teacher or a kindergarten teacher. The general plan is to send a teacher to settlements with about 15 children. This teacher would be paid by the group, participate in farming during part of the day, but primarily focus on teaching. There are also traveling teachers, workers who share the daily labor with settlers and teach adults in the evenings about subjects relevant to their work or interests. Many young settlers, despite being slaves to their ancient land, are not content to just farm. They are eager for knowledge and strive for education while serving the land with tools and intellect alike. Their intellectual aspirations remain strong despite their physical labor. Currently, the educational systems in these settlements are vague and inadequate. It's unclear how to integrate the financially non-productive role of a teacher into the community budget without creating a significant deficit. There's also the challenge of settlements with only a few children and not many women. On the other hand, the high intellectual level of some settlers has led to young children becoming overly mature, sitting with adults, overhearing conversations, and becoming privy to the concerns of their communities without having peers of their own age. Previously, I've mentioned the unique libraries one can find in tents and barracks of settlers, which deserve attention similar to schools and universities. These collections are essential, and a lack of them leaves a noticeable void. They primarily consist of Hebrew books, both originals and translated works of modern authors, though there are too few translations. Technical works, classics, and quality books from modern German and English authors should be brought to these settlements. Attempts to create circulating libraries are ongoing, but struggle due to lack of resources. Nonetheless, addressing the intellectual hunger of these young immigrants is as important as their physical well-being. Efforts to collect funds for the colonization should also involve donations of books and magazines for the youth libraries. I mentioned Hugo Bergman, the head of the National Library in Jerusalem. If anyone, this noble friend and advisor is well suited to organize these vital libraries for the settlements. Palestine has seen 3 waves of Jewish immigration: the Kollel, dating back to Talmudic times, the Bilu immigrants of the 1880s, and the Shaluzim since 1905, following the first major Russian Revolution. The same spirit drove all 3 groups to Palestine. However, time, circumstances, and misunderstandings have alienated these groups from each other, even causing hostility. The Kollalim were supported by the Chalukah, a type of alms or subsidy purely philanthropic and religious in nature, as they were akin to monks and nuns in mission, tasked with prayer, scriptural interpretation, and pilgrimage to holy sites where they wished to be buried. Devout individuals and organizations from all over the world provided their fellow countrymen, those in need, believers, and scholars, with the necessities of life. Until recent years, the Chalukah system was in full operation. The recipients could devote themselves to their prayers and rituals without any worries. However, the hardships of wartime abruptly cut off their stipends, which had already been heavily impacted by the Zionist organization's fundraising aimed at work and colonization efforts. And now the devout and scholars engage in various small trades without neglecting their prayers and rituals. It's no surprise they don't have a favorable opinion of the Zionists. The Bilus, the word is an acronym for Beth Jacob Leshu Wenelsha, meaning House of Jacob, let us go, were Russian students, the first true settlers in Jewish Palestine. Among them were some well-known revolutionaries at home. It was the era when young Russian students were joining the people in the Narodniki movement. However, the driving force behind their actions was the pogroms and social disenfranchisement in the diaspora. A few of these bilis arrived in Palestine with some rubles in their pockets, but knew next to nothing about the country and the conditions for colonization. In the colony of Petah Tikwa, Gate of Hope, and in Rehoboth, they began their work under hardships, surpassing even the challenges faced by today's pioneers. In Rehoboth, some lived for a long time in earthen caves, and many succumbed to malaria without knowing about or utilizing drainage methods. Today, the bilis, who were well cared for by the foundations of Parisian Rothschilds, German aid associations, French alliances, Russian, and other organizations, feel like the aristocrats of Jewish Palestine. They look down with open disdain on the young socialists and communists, who are their flesh and blood. To understand the reason for this contempt, I asked several of these aristocrats about their opinions on the pioneers and received an enlightening response. The nature and behavior of the pioneers, their experiments, meaning the sums spent by the Commission on projects like those by Nuris and others, the pioneers' lack of respect for Jewish tradition, and thus the bilis, all these were reasons for their disdain. One of the venerable men made it clear, I came over here with 5,000 rubles. They do not understand the new era, fail to see the connection between their Zionist beliefs and those of today's followers. They consider themselves the aristocracy, while the others are the proletariat. Well, the pioneers would likely laugh off such nonsense if it weren't for a spiteful undertone that envy barely describes. In modern Palestine, no issue highlights the divide between the bourgeois, rigid settlers of the past and the intellectual political proletarians of today more than the issue of wage labor, the relationship of the established Jewish settler to Arab laborers and to the Jewish worker in the kibbutz. Rishon LeZion is one of the oldest and certainly the most famous of all Jewish colonies in Palestine. An hour south of Jaffa, the rich, sweet wine of Judea ages in Rothschild's Rishon cellars. Our car rolls down a wide, long, unpaved street flanked by small gardens and simple houses that give off the vibe of a Bessarabian or southern Russian village street, though the synagogue, admin buildings, and a hotel add a bit more flair. As we reach the end of this street and leave Rishon's borders, dozens of naked brown kids suddenly dance in front of our wheels, just like gypsy children at the edge of a Polish village. Coming down from the hills where Arab workers, villagers, and Bedouins live in open, dark tents. After some difficult travel, getting stuck in the bottomless mud of the road leading to nearby Nes Ziona, we return to Rishon in the evening, driving through to the other end of the colony. Here, from a jumble of small, shabby wooden huts, patched with metal sheets and rags, agitated and loudly complaining, Yemeni Jews approach us. In our car are Ettinger and Dr. Rupin. The Yemenis complain about the miserable housing they've been forced to endure at the colony's edge for years. We can point to 6 small brick houses being built by a group of young Jewish workers across from their shacks. The Yemenis protest. 6 houses. It's too few for them. The young Jews of the Baukuza are building those 6 houses where the Yemenites are supposed to be relocated under the direction of the Zionist Commission, not the colonists of Rishon LeZion. The old rich colonists of Rishon don't have the money for it. They've let their Yemenite co-religionists live for years at the edge of their colony in huts and shacks, so the commission in Jerusalem had to hire a kuza to build houses for the Yemenites in Rishon. It's important to note that the Rishon colonists don't hire Jewish workers. They use those Bedouins and Fellahin from the other end of their colony. They're cheap, have few needs, and are satisfied with minimal wages. Meanwhile, the young Jewish workers are roaming the streets of nearby Jaffa, Tel Aviv, hungry and jobless. They can't compete with the Arab laborers. Their organizations have set higher wage rates, and they'll never reach the low standard of living of the Arabs. That's why the Jewish colonist rejects the Jewish worker. This is one example. Another is Chedera. Chedera is north of Jaffa and was founded around 1890. The Chedera colonists also employed Arab laborers who lived in villages near the area. These Arabs, especially the women and children who were used for almond picking, were content with minimal wages, and the colony flourished because of it. However, during the riots in May of this year, these same Arab laborers stormed into Chedera and half-destroyed the colony. After that, the people of Chedera swore a solemn oath never to use Arab help again. Near Chedera, in Shefsaba, that famous German-Czechoslovak Chalutz group had settled, which I've already mentioned. Now the Shefsaba group has moved away to avoid starving, since the Chedera colonists are back to employing their old enemies, the Arabs, who fought against them barely 5 months ago. Arab labor is cheap, and the Chalutz can't compete with the Arab. It's hard to stay calm in the face of such events, as one realizes what idea is being frivolously gambled with here, and the potential for sudden explosions or eruptions. Already young, hungry, and jobless Chalutzim have shown their bitterness in drastic ways. In the Jewish suburb of Jaffa, Tel Aviv, they drove away Arab workers from a new build that a Yemenite Jew was having constructed. The construction suffered some damage in the process. The Yemenite then complained in a notorious anti-Zionist Arab newspaper about the young Jews who played this trick on him. As expected, the anti-Semitic press in Palestine capitalized on the incident. They claimed that if the Jews here start pogroms against their own co-religionists, the British government would finally open its eyes. We're waiting for that moment. But the organizations of Jewish workers still maintain strict discipline among their people. Solidarity prevents catastrophe. Incidentally, that Yemenite was placed under a great ban and expelled from the religious community. In some parts of Palestine, younger settler groups have tried to solve the issue of low-paid labor in a commendable way that aligns with their communal beliefs. To avoid putting too much strain on the group and causing a deficit, the settlers deducted a fraction of their own wages and allocated it to their Jewish helpers who were poorly paid for tasks like almond picking and similar menial work. A note on the topic: Yemenite Jews. These semi-Arab Jews, who migrated from the southeastern coast of the Red Sea and remained at the cultural level of the Arabs, have been allotted their own settlement areas in many parts of Palestine. The Yemenites tend to their fields and cultivate their land efficiently, but there is no real connection between them and their European immigrant co-religionists. The way they live, their style of housing, language, appearance, they are olive-brown people of short stature, sparse beards, long, bluish-black thin hair, resembling degenerate Sephardim, seems to have placed them apart from the European immigration. It would be an exaggeration to claim that the Chalutz and Bilu treat the Yemenite like the Puritans treated the North American Indians, and today the whites treat the Negro. Despite the shared faith that brings Yemenites closer to Jews than to Arabs, who are also related by blood, there remains a significant divide, a cultural and racial strangeness. During my travels in the Galilean village of Sejera, I encountered an unusual group among Jewish immigrants, the Gerim. Literally translated, Ger means ward or protected person. The Gerim are Russian Sabbatarians who have converted to Judaism because they can observe the Sabbath in a Jewish community. If you ask a Ger, who still looks entirely like a Russian peasant, why he chose to become a Jew, he'll reply, because he, like you, keeps the Sabbath, and it's convenient to have a kosher butcher living next door to slaughter his chickens. The Ger wears prayer straps, follows his neighbor's math rituals, and speaks Hebrew with them, even with his wife and children. Yet if a dispute arises between a Ger and a Jew, the Ger will still try to insult the Jew with the Russian curse word for Jew. Jewish settlers have good relations with the Templars, the German colonists. The High Commissioner of Palestine, the British Jew Herbert Samuel, brought the German Templars back to the Holy Land after the war had driven them from their colonies in Jerusalem, Haifa, and the Sharon Plain near Jaffa. This was one of Sir Samuel's first acts. The English government even supports the German settlers in their endeavors, although they have commandeered many of their best houses for administrative purposes and levy high taxes on others. The Templar settlements in Haifa, at the foot of Mount Carmel, the small outposts Sarona and Wilhelma near Jaffa, with their neat and well-constructed houses, pretty well-kept flower gardens, well-maintained roads, and friendly people are a pleasure and refreshment. One feels disheartened when traveling home from Petach Tikva, which resembles an unkempt Polish ghetto village, through the Swabian colony of Sorona, with its fields lined in violet. You think, trudging through the endless muck of the streets in Rishon LeZion or the Mea Shearim road in Jerusalem, of those well-ordered rows of houses by Carmel. You question whether the immense effort of those old Jewish colonists and their European patrons was worthwhile if the result is merely a bank account, Arab wage labor, these embarrassing Bessarabian village streets. Do not the state of their homes and communities betray the mindset of those venerable aristocrats, in the culture and the outward signs of their daily lives? How will Nuris look in 40 years? Style and aesthetics are only found amongst the natives. Truly, every Arab is a feast for the eyes. How even the poorest man wears his rags reveals a deep, uninterrupted tradition growing out of the land. The burnous, headscarf, slippers of the men, the clothing of the woman, of the fellah, and her rings, bracelets, necklaces, even the cut and color of the sacks, an Arab loads upon his camel bear witness to a vanished but visually perceptible era of ancient, intense culture. Every letter in the Quran is an ornament. The simplest place of worship is a work of art, making the poverty or primitive excess, the lack of taste and banality of Christian and Jewish worship houses stand out even more. The most revered of these Christian churches, in Jerusalem, Bethlehem, Haifa, with their thousands of lamps, votive offerings, and poor paintings, are labyrinths of mixed styles. Only synagogues with an oriental touch, like those of Damascus, Aleppo, and Bukhara, are passable. Arab culture, more than that of Western peoples, has its roots in religion. Even today, this religious element defines the environment in which the Arab moves. When you become acquainted with his ideas of justice and duty, his valuation of women, children, masters and servants, strangers and peers, he appears as a primitive beast separated by a millennia-wide gulf from Western people. A dangerous barbarian against whom there are only two protections, gold and weapons. Yet see this same man approach his God. At the holy places of his faith, at sunrise, sunset, amid the chaos of profane crowds, his appearance is transfigured, his spirit suddenly lifted in a mystic way. He seems to grow in stature to places no one else can reach, unless they too have the compelling breath of the mysterious Orient in their blood. However, one would surely be mistaken to try to explain and solve the problem of today's Arab, the Arab masses one encounters in Palestine, solely through religion. The idea of trying to connect today's Arabs with incoming Jews purely on a cultural basis is also flawed. At the Zionist Congress in Carlsbad, a well-respected professor from Berlin went so far as to claim that a chair for Arabic literature should be established at the University of Jerusalem, suggesting that this would immediately bring the races closer and reconcile them. Theorist Kalvarisky, inspired by the Christian Muslim clubs in Egypt, wants to create associations where Jews and Arabs can meet and start understanding each other as members of the same ancient family. However, he overlooks the fact that Jews don't have the same powerful forces backing them as Christians do in those Egyptian clubs, which serve a clear anti-British stance inspired by France and the Vatican's Middle Eastern policy. Anyone who has not been to Palestine, who hasn't seen the fellahin and Bedouins on the edges of Jewish colonies, shouldn't speak about the Arab question and the Palestinian Arabs. Even for someone who has never set foot in the mysterious lands of Transjordan, or doesn't know the moral codes and ideas about property and honor that exist there among the uncharted peoples, extreme caution is advised. One can't draw a sharp geographical or cultural line between the unknown, countless masses of Transjordan and the 700,000 Palestinian Arabs, just as one can't rely on a strict set of rules or dogmas that would allow the Jewish immigrant to be secured against tenfold numbers. I had the chance to speak with the young governor of Beersheba about the strange customs and concepts of justice, life, and property he encounters in his exposed position, where the paths from the east and west meet. As a British official, he's sometimes required to arbitrate disputes that only Transjordanian tradition can justify. Examples: blood revenge mixes with property compensation. If a kidnapped woman returns with a child, the tribe that took her must pay her family more goats, sheep, and camels than if she had returned childless. If a brother is killed, the number of camels and goats varies compared to the compensation for a son-in-law or grandfather. Murder can be settled either by vengeful killing or a material equivalent. The number of wives a local effendi keeps isn't driven by his basic desires, but by the amount of work needed in his house and field. Even if he finds satisfaction with one beloved wife, he might let her die without medical help if the cost of a doctor and medicine exceeds what he'd pay to buy a new wife from her family. The Arabs and Muslims' notion of possession over women is linked with religious ideas and laws that justify and elevate his sexual egoism. Imagine the gap between an Arab who lets his wife walk down the street in a wide black dress and a thick veil, and a Shalitz who walks down the same street singing with his female comrade after sunset. People often told me that the lower Arab has less hatred for the Jewish worker whose labor he witnesses than for the Jewish city dweller whose work is a mystery to him, or the colonist for whom he performs hard, underpaid labor. I don't believe in such judgments, just as I don't believe in a primary and primitive hatred of Arabs against Jews. A friendly glance at the working foreigner and a bond through community labor assumes a much higher ethical level than what the Arab possesses today. On the contrary, when a fella sees the incomprehensible Shalitz lowering himself to a level of material self-denial similar to his own, he might become suspicious, and the respect he entertained for a foreign ruling race quickly disappears. Here I spoke of the lower-class Arabs, the ones at the lowest cultural and economic levels among Palestinian Arabs. It's another story with the upper class, the effendis. The locals, whether they are farmhands or Bedouins, are mostly day laborers, small tenants, or severely exploited land slaves working for large landowners. These landowners, just a few families, hold most of the land and sell their estates to the national fund. Yet even these elite, the effendis, are merely pawns of the French Vatican interests. The effendis are disillusioned. They expected a flood of money with the arrival of the settlers, associating Jews with wealth. The Jews arrived in Palestine with grand fanfare, but the financial influx was much less than anticipated. Some effendis fell into heavy debts, hoping to sell their land at high prices, and now they are disappointed and retaliate. Another source of discontent is that Jewish employers have increased the price of labor, making it harder to exploit the local fellahin workers, who are no longer living like half-starved animals since the Jews came. Often in Jerusalem, poor Jewish teachers and minor officials, paid with promissory notes for months, have to rely on the credit of Arab merchants in the bazaar. Arabs know the Jews aren't going anywhere, yet this doesn't lessen their contempt. Nonetheless, these Jews, a small minority with modest economic support, enjoy special protection from the government. They have a national council and an executive body to represent their interests, which outnumbered Arabs lack. Someone once asked me if the Arab national liberation movement is driven by genuine needs of the Arab people or simply a ploy by the effendis to block Jewish immigration for their own reasons. This is a difficult question with complex underlying issues. The great powers manipulating both Arabs and Jews are not genuinely concerned about either group. When discussing recent pogroms in Jerusalem, you'll find some informed Arabs subtly hinting at the massive barracks of the French monastery Sacré-Cœur, frequented by French generals from the Syrian occupation forces and Vatican missionaries. Sometimes they also glance towards the Damascus Gate, where the anti-Semitic Stores sits in the British government house, a man reminiscent of Pontius Pilate. More on him later. Alleged racial hatred of Arabs towards Jews who share the same heritage is a result of World War I. Before 1914, there were no pogroms, and racial issues weren't significant or dangerous. For Muslim Arabs, despite shared religious heritage like Abraham, Rachel, Haram, and Josaphat, Palestine doesn't hold the same significance as it does for Jews. The Arabs' Jerusalem is Baghdad, their Moses is Harun al-Rashid. I heard this statement from a lecture by Sokolov, and it made sense to me. The heart of Muslim culture isn't in Jerusalem, but in the venerated Al-Azhar Mosque and University in Cairo. It's different motivations, not religious or nationalistic ones, that set Muslims against Jews. The murky maneuvering for control in the East grows more complex with the emergence of a pro-English sentiment among young Arabs. While the older Arabs, unchanged from Turkish rule, remain ungraspable outsiders and yielders to French Christian interests, the younger generation is heavily influenced by English schools that have replaced French and German institutes, instilling English language, sports, high church attitude, and a dose of Anglophilia. Through strategic intelligence, English imperialism has awakened in Arabs tendencies suited for its global rule at these strategic locations. Some believe that these anglicized young Arabs are starting to show sympathy toward Zionist immigration due to English influence. Nevertheless, conflicting and intersecting currents flow between Palestinian Arabs, which might one day pose a threat to the land and its people. Thus, trenches around Jewish settlements, whether in the plains or mountains, remain a somber necessity. And it came to pass afterward that half of the young men worked, while the other half held spears, shields, bows, and armor, and the leaders stood behind the whole house of Judah, those who built on the wall and those who carried burdens. With one hand they did the work, and with the other they held the weapon. Nehemiah 4:10-11. Since Nehemiah's time, not much has changed for the Jews in the old homeland. During the November pogrom, just days before I arrived in Palestine, shouts echoed through the streets of the holy city like these: "This land is our land, the Jews are our dogs, and Spirit of Muhammad, raise your sword." If the young Jewish community hadn't been well prepared on that 2nd of November, no one would have survived in the old Jewish quarter near the Wailing Wall. Be cautious with such statements, but I know what I'm talking about. The pioneer has learned to wield a sword alongside a trowel, which is why the Jewish community in Palestine is not lost. They hold the weapon with a strong and pure hand, for what is at stake on these plains and in those mountains is the building of the third temple, the temple in spirit. Trenches, ditches, shelters, and the field hospitals of Nuris are not new. The construction of the Arab house with its high stone walls, the strategic locations of cities, and their difficult access point to a constant threat that humans pose to one another. It's the necessity to defend and adjust one's entire outward life to this necessity. Jerusalem itself, rising from the rocks and surrounded by deep water beds, still resembles a fortress that is hard to conquer. Every Jew in Palestine lives their life on qui vive. It's a tough life, and you have to keep your nerves to endure it. An occasion taught me how danger gnaws at the nerves of our people. In Haifa, where the most dangerous anti-Jewish Arab Nationalist Action Committee is based, on the first evening of the Land Workers' Congress, shouts suddenly erupted in the narrow street. We fell silent upstairs. A pogrom? An attack? People remained calm. It lasted a good while, but it was just the nearby cinema where the show had ended and the audience was pouring into the street. The next day this happened. It was evening again. The debates were heated and noisy. Then wild noise, the glow of fire, and the clashing of metal rose from the street. Torches approached our building, which housed the workers' club and kitchen. Frenzied dancers swung swords, raised shields over their turbans, held hands, and staggered wildly along the narrow street. Two sat on chairs they had brought, and the wild torch circle swirled around them for minutes. As if it were about blood, Damascus blades rained down on small round steel shields, and the fighters jumped at each other, shouting wild joy, fury, delight at the sound of iron on iron. Again our negotiations suffered an interruption. Away from the window. This is Haifa. We are Jews. They know we're gathered up here. The street is narrow, the staircase is slim, the roofs lead to nowhere. If the house were surrounded, a torch thrown in, no one would escape. I looked into pale faces, but they were calm. Only the torchlight flickered on them. After a few minutes, the torch dance and swordplay moved to the big square. It was just a small play, a sort of joyful dance, friends giving a serenade to a newlywed couple. I followed the torches several streets away. Celebration, outburst of joy, beastly wildness. Imagine if they got serious, anger surges, the prophet's name is evoked. But even from such relatively harmless fantasias, something very real can develop. Like back then, during the reception in Beit Shean in ancient Bashan, Og's capital, when that spear flew over Sir Herbert Samuel's head and shots were fired at the car. It was merely a fantasia, a showy display by the locals in honor of the High Commissioner. When, before the first program number, a black camel with a veiled woman slowly passed by Sir Samuel, those knowledgeable in the entourage knew what it meant. Two major Hebrew newspapers are published in Palestine, Doar Hayom, Daily Mail, and Haaretz, The Land. Doar Hayom, conservative and capitalist, is dyed in yellow like its godfather and role model, not that yellow is specifically meant as the color of the Jew. The B'nai Benjamin group, a faction of the old Jewish colonizers, represents a kind of fake aristocracy, leaning heavily towards English culture. Haaretz is more liberal, extending a friendly hand to the pioneers, without abandoning its core middle-class values. Meanwhile, the radical labor movement has an excellent weekly publication, Hapel Hazair, known for its high literary standards. Critics argue that these Jewish newspapers handle the Arab issue with unnecessary caution. They don't fully convey the seriousness of the situation in Palestine. There's a lack of that underlying despair felt among the Jewish populace, which flares up at the mere mention of the Arab question. Even pogroms aren't discussed with the emphasis they deserve. Is this a deliberate attempt to cover things up, or just an effort not to provoke tensions in Palestine and among the Jewish diaspora? If the motive is political, one could call it weakness or timidity, especially since the Arab press is relentless in its incitement and manipulation of facts. It's worth noting that these inflammatory Arab papers are edited by Christian Arabs with clear ties to the stronghold of the Sacred Heart. Only one Arab publication, edited by Muslim Arabs, maintains a friendly tone towards Jews. Small as it is, it lacks influence. The Jewish press does not effectively counter the anti-Jewish narrative of the Arab media by assertively voicing its own perspective. Jewish-friendly English officials within the government have asked, why do Jews remain passive when unjustly attacked and left vulnerable, especially when they proudly announce their achievement of a Jewish homeland in Palestine? Outwardly boastful, yet inwardly insecure, they offer Arabs an easy target, playing into the hands of those who wish to exacerbate the situation. This hesitation is also evident in other political blunders by Zionists, who show fear towards non-Jewish powers and influences in Palestine. I've heard complaints about the modest financial requests made of England for Jewish schools in Palestine, while Arab schools receive significant government funding. Eliezer ben Yehuda is the respected scholar credited as the father of modern Hebrew, which has taken root in schools, settlements, and everyday life. 20, even 10 years ago, dozens of dialects mingled in Palestine, each Jewish immigrant bringing their own. Schools used Yiddish, the Sephardic dialect, French, and German. Today, whether in homes, streets, plains, or mountains, Hebrew is predominantly spoken, a language once exclusive to Ben Yehuda's household. Like English in America, unifying the nation, Jewish nationalism now strengthens through Hebrew. Ben Yehuda has been working for years on a Hebrew encyclopedia. Numerous enthusiasts and scholars, many eccentric dreamers abound in Palestine, are modernizing the language, adapting ancient idioms to today's realities. Ben Yehuda told me his task is now to adapt and slightly alter biblical Hebrew for daily use. I asked if he desired Hebrew to become a local, Arab-tinged dialect due to ongoing immigration, but his response was only that Hebrew is a national necessity. Interestingly, Hapel Hazair, a radical workers' party, adopted Hebrew among their Palestinian members, and today, even in the places most resistant to nationalism, Hebrew is spoken. So, Europeans shouldn't mind if zealots scour the Bible for terms equivalent to car, gasoline, airplane, afternoon tea, and flirt. He shouldn't get too caught up in the fact that children who get Hebrew lessons in their schools might look down on their parents at home with pity and obvious disdain when they catch them making errors in Hebrew. There's been a fervent wave of Hebrew enthusiasm sweeping through the Jewish community in Palestine. Fierce intolerance and a distinctly chauvinistic misuse of the language for purposes that no longer align with the spirit of Judaism. I personally got a bitter taste of this, one that left me uneasy for quite some time. I delivered a lecture on Russia in the auditorium of a school in Jerusalem, attended by workers and middle-class intellectuals. Since I don't speak Hebrew, I gave my talk in German. Ben Zvi, the leader of the Palestinian workers, chaired the meeting, and my friend, the scholar Hugo Bergman, translated. Only a few in the large audience didn't understand German. I noticed this from the spontaneous approval some of my points received. Neither the lecture nor the discussion, the speakers spoke in Hebrew, and their speeches were translated for me, sparked even the slightest protest against me for daring to speak a foreign tongue in Jerusalem. The next morning, I learned from an article by Ben Yehuda in the Doar Hayom that I was considered a traitor to the Jewish cause in Palestine, accused of serving foreign idols, dragging a new exile into the homeland, desecrating a place where the battle against the evil forces of exile was being fought. The passionate article ended with an appeal to the country not to tolerate such desecration in the future. What an uproar! Was Doar Hayom targeting my topic as they attacked my use of German? A few days after this incident, I visited the colony of Holda. It's a beautiful farm with mixed cultivation. The settlers had built a stone barn where they proudly showed us a new Holstein cow they'd acquired. Sitting under the cow, milking, was a female pioneer. Every time the cow moved away from the milk bucket, the milker would exclaim, "Oh, Mauritian!" She spoke German to the cow, but Hebrew to us. The practicality of this bilingualism became vividly clear to me. I asked the milker if the cow would give more milk once it responded to the name Miriam. Perhaps Hebrew is emphasized so intensely as the national language in Palestine because Yiddish is seen as a bizarre, corrupted mix. Many pioneers seem to feel ashamed of Yiddish, their mother tongue. Mr. Gordon in Tel Aviv showed me a questionnaire where an immigrant wrote Esperanto in the section for mother tongue. Yet Yiddish is a living, very lively language in many aspects. It can't be eradicated from the world. In many ways, it is like Esperanto. Scattered worldwide, millions read hundreds of Yiddish newspapers. It's the Congress language of Jewish international worker organizations. It has its literature, its treasure trove of songs. Jewish folklore is nonsensical without the idiom of the Hasidim. Beneath the nationalistic surface of Palestinian Hebrew, Yiddish undoubtedly continues to live on, undiminished and unbroken. The fiercest opposition to the new Hebrew in Palestine, of course, comes from the old Jews of the pre-Zionist Kollel. They reserved the sacred language for worship, rejecting its profanation by everyday use, along with other Zionist innovations that deeply offend them. Besides the Hebrew taking hold and the Yiddish thriving by its global legitimacy, the idioms mingled with Arabic elements of the Sephardim, Yemenites, and Alapines also persist in Palestine. In this context, mention must be made of the Herzl Gymnasium in Tel Aviv. Before the war, it had about 800 students. Now, there are 600. The gymnasium receives no support from the government. The Zionist Commission contributes £4,000 to its maintenance, and it collects $7,000 to $8,000 in school fees. It is run with a progressive spirit. Its director, Mossenson, was the first to dare to read parts of the Bible bareheaded in public Hebrew school, viewing the Bible as a history book. Other reforms at the school, originating from America, affecting both the teaching and school community, have not spread beyond Tel Aviv, not even to nearby Jerusalem, where different laws apply, a more rigid adherence to old forms prevails, and the entire structure of society and education remains deeply rooted in sacred tradition. The curse from the Orthodox community is aimed in a different direction, rather than at the Herzl Gymnasium in Tel Aviv. That institution, seen as a privilege for a small upper class, doesn't seem as perilous to them as the elementary schools for the new immigrants, where modern educational ideas are taking root among the children. The Orthodox schools announce their presence from 3 streets away with an overwhelming clamor. Approaching this noise, you find a modest room where a Turkish man, dressed in a broad, dirty coat and wearing a fez, stands in front of a slate board with a stick in hand. He whacks the blackboard with it, causing it to shake and groan. Around 50 kids, the oldest about 12, sit in 10 rows of benches and shout sacred lines from the ancient texts in unison, a practice intended to ingrain the syllables, words, and their hidden meanings, difficult to grasp at their age, through sheer volume and commotion. This is the Keder. Next door is the yeshiva, where young boys are initiated into the deeper secrets of the revered texts. Zionist schools, on the other hand, have replaced this rote memorization with modern education, teaching a range of secular subjects and sciences. There are around 130 purely Hebrew schools in Palestine, employing 600 teachers and educating 3,000 students. Additionally, there are 3 teacher training institutes, With no compulsory schooling, Orthodox families can send their children to cheder, while others might choose the new schools. Increasingly, some Jewish families even send their children to English-led Christian schools. Occasionally, you can find Arab children in Hebrew schools. Exalting Hebrew as a national language poses a real threat to Palestinian Jewry. The land falls under British dominion. At best, it is so today, but it's also an Arab land where Jews form a strikingly small minority. The British authorities need Jewish officials who not only speak Hebrew, but are also proficient in English. This necessity is gradually leading to bilingual education. To stay in the country, Jews must learn the languages of the dominant population, adding Arabic to their English skills. If they want to remain connected to the world, Palestinian Jews cannot afford to solely focus on Hebrew. There is a worldly connection that is currently more crucial than reviving a dead language through artificial means. As the nationalist language fervor peaks, many young Jews in Palestine may find themselves isolated from the rest of the world. Settled in a remote corner of the earth, Jewish Palestine must strive to maintain linguistic ties with the nations of the diaspora. Hebrew chauvinism will give way as the importance of broad social connections becomes evident. Viewed from the rooftop of the house known as Pilate's House, the Holy City appears as a hillside sloping eastward, with rooftops tightly packed. The city walls and ramparts drop deep into rock clefts, empty stone waterways where here and there a trickle of water still flows at legendary sites. Hinnom, the valley of Gehenna; Kidron, also known as Jehoshaphat, crossed by the greatest Jews when heading to the Mount of Olives, and the brook El Hose, beside which Scopus rises. This white maze of flat roofs and yellowish walls, devoid of greenery, descends sharply to the east. It's the holy city, the one to remember with hands clasped over your eyes in your final hour. At the base of the Haram, now a Muslim holy site, stands the old temple, visible only to the true believers, constructed and reconstructed many times, deeply nestled in the Kidron Gorge. Rising from the stone basin of the riverbed, an endless, boundless city of the dead stretches out. At the deepest level lies Absalom's grave with its pointed cone, then the tombs of Zechariah and Jehoshaphat, the rock temple. Above these, the gentle slope of the Mount of Olives is speckled with flat white slabs, marking the stone coffins. Nameless Jewish graves, countless and numberless. The holy city, the eternally living, faces east. The city of the dead, climbing the Mount of Olives, looks upon the holy city. Thus dictates eternity. Remember, remember Jerusalem, you living, you dead. Before the sun rises over the Mount of Olives, the muezzin calls from high atop the minaret of the Haram. His call is a mix of sobbing, lamenting, and then, like a bird's song, joyfully rises to the sky in prayer and exhortation. The early light falls on the lovely broad plain, and the blue walls of the Dome of the Rock shine bright. A ray of the sun passes through the multicolored windows, illuminating the gray, misshapen giant rock enclosed by the mosque. It's the Rock of Moriah, from which Muhammad is said to have attempted his ascent to heaven, the same rock where Abraham was to sacrifice his son. This mysterious stone glows with the reflected colors of the sun through the vibrant stained glass. Now the city stirs awake. Bells ring out here and there from monasteries, churches, and cathedrals, some dull and heavy, others bright and quick, like children's laughter. Only the hidden places of the Jews remain silent, buried within the old walls of Zion. Quietly, with covered heads, the Jews lament, sing, and sob their prayers. Their devotion must not rise to the heavens, unlike the worship of others. In the narrow, winding streets, everyday life is already bustling, with people bustling around. Under the arches, in the long, smoky, dim bazaar, masses of crowded Orientals haggle, push, and shove. Unlike the loud, joyous clamor of Cairo's Muski, thriving with relaxed coffee drinkers, laughter from deep within, enjoying life every day, here the atmosphere is subdued, tense, and menacing under smoky, mossy ceilings that roof the streets. The traders' shops are like deep, cellar-like dungeons. The entire old city seems a labyrinth of low, ruin-like houses, about which one cannot tell whether they will be built higher one day or have ceased construction because they are meant to fall. Narrow, crooked alleyways snake like mud veins between the sloping walls of houses. High-built monasteries gaze down through barred windows on the winding paths below, as hurried figures in white robes, billowing gowns, press against their heavy doors, quickly swallowed by the enclosed, mysterious silence. This city has 3 holy days every week. Thursday evening marks the start of the Muslim one, Friday evening the Jewish one, and Sunday morning the Christian one. 3 of humanity's religions trace their origins back to these walled, cliff-studded, gloomy stones. Leaving the Mount Zion, where pioneers are building a new synagogue, I pass by the Haram Gate, behind which lies the rock floating in Omar's mosque. I enter the Via Dolorosa, following Christ's footsteps to Golgotha. With each step over the sharp stones of the steep path, I'm drawn deeper into the gentle power of this Son of Man, feeling more deeply and painfully connected to his love-born death-crown doctrine. The wondrous flower of passion bloomed, arising from the noble ground of pure Judaism, love for the poorest, a fight against oppressors, liberation from slavery. Its halo is misunderstanding, mockery, torment, and sacrificial death. Its scent fills the endless veil of tears of humanity. Isn't it the same religion that today, after thousands of years, flowers again from the same noble ground of Judaism, across the plains of Galilee and the hills of Judea, from the magnificent souls of young people? For a moment, I lean against the wall under the arch from which the words Ecce Homo were spoken, and close my eyes. Quicker than thought, my pounding heart flies to the unholy city, to the barren, noisy sidewalk, to a house, an inn called Eden, where 2 other great religious figures were crucified for their faith, Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg, apostles of a new dawning fate for the world, murdered by a brutal gang of mercenaries. Where does the teaching begin? Where does it end? Why must it always be Jews, born from Jews, over whose martyred deaths, crucified bodies, the sun of new eras rises? The holy places of humanity in the Orient are, if not immovable and undeniably gazing towards heaven like the pyramids of Giza, mostly apocryphal, sanctified errors through centuries of worship. That's the birth crypt in Bethlehem and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. Golgotha likely rose at the opposite end of the Via Dolorosa, outside the city, on a hill discovered by General Gordon near the Damascus Gate. All these holy sites, real or not, get ruined for the devout visitor by swarms of human pests. Guides, relic hawkers, camel drivers, fortune tellers, pimps, extortionists, and beggars. In fact, these sites are downright stolen from their visitors. The Christian holy sites in Palestine are also arenas for the wildest feuds, jealousy, and bloody battles among monks of all faiths, Catholics, Greek Orthodox, Armenians, and Copts. In the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, during the supposedly sacred fire ceremonies, people practically squashed each other to get their own candles lit first. In the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem, where the humble manger supposedly stood, and the oxen and donkeys made their noises while the 3 wise men knelt, your guide will show you bullet holes in the walls. It was down there, perhaps on Christmas Eve, that Armenian and Greek monks fought a battle with 2 fatalities, setting alight the brocade coverings of the holy walls. You can still see the scorch marks above the soldier's cot. He sits there day and night, supposedly keeping watch to prevent the keepers of the shrine from attacking each other or shooting and setting fires again when they light their lamps at the spot where Jesus was born. Each denomination has its own lamps. The Roman Catholics come down from their chapel over the crypt, unlock a grate where their lamps hang, light them, lock the grate back up, and return to their chapel. The Armenians and Greek Orthodox do the same. Each denomination has its own chapel, united in the large Church of the Nativity above the crypt. The Armenians have laid a carpet on the marble tiles leading from their chapel to the crypt entrance, cut at such an angle that the neighboring Roman Catholics have to walk on the bare stone floor when they go to the same entrance. There's also the famous window above a small side altar. It was covered in thick cobwebs for 100 years because each denomination jealously watched to make sure the others didn't clean the window unauthorized. Then came the Protestant General Allenby, conquered the Holy Land, pointed the web out to a soldier, and just like that, the cobweb and its legend were gone. At the Western Wall, or as some call it, the Wailing Wall, men and women come to pray from early morning until late at night. Weeping women press their tearful faces against the ancient stones, sitting on the ground and clinging to the wall like a child to their mother. Old men bow and tap their foreheads on the cold, worn surface, while boys in traditional attire chant psalms, looking timidly to the side at strangers. Nails are driven into the crevices between the massive stones, each hammer strike a prayer for health. A man with gout limps over, ladles rainwater from a stone recess, and rubs it on his eyes, neck, and joints. Deep in the washed-out, crumbling joints of the wall burn tiny candles, glowing reddish. This is the sacred site, all that remains of the ancient temple. The splendor of Solomon is now just words and whispers. It's a narrow courtyard or passage between walls, barely 50 paces long. The stones rise high but go even deeper beneath the street surface that cannot be removed to expose them. It's the only pilgrimage site for Jews. Crowds of Oriental-looking figures, having traveled from far, gather at the feet of the stone wall that stretches toward the sky. Yemenites, Ethiopian Jews, North African Jews with their guide. 4 or 5 narrow, winding alleys away, the sounds of kneeling, crouching poor, both men and women, old and young, echo and lead visitors to the wall. The loud cries come from these beggars, not the worshippers at the wall. Only occasionally does one of the women weeping at the wall sob loudly like a wounded animal. As the visitor turns to leave, dozens of worshippers, weeping women, and pilgrims break from their prayers, jump to their feet, and stretch their hands out. Bakshish, bakshish. The holy sites of the Orient leave a bitter aftertaste. With their low, underground, rat-hole-like dwellings that barely resemble human homes, the ancient holy city presents an ongoing danger for its poorer residents, Jews, Christians, and Muslims alike. Misfortune, misery, and pestilence fester in these sunless hideaways. Dirt, smoke, and decay poison the poor residents living in the piles of ruins and incomplete houses. For the Jews living near the old wall, right next to the most hostile elements of the Arab population, the danger is terrifying. There's no escape if a pogrom is unleashed. In the last one, the enemy broke into houses, nailed to walls, murdered in beds, found dead in dark corners, poor Jewish cripples, the sick, pregnant women. Get the residents out of the old city. Move them out into the open, to the new part of the city near the Jaffa Gate. More and more voices are calling for this. Clear out the old holy city. It should become a place for pilgrimage, a museum, like the Roman Forum, like the edge of the Sahara with the pyramids and the Sphinx near Cairo. Clear the holy city, into the open. Yet, within the magical confines of the ancient walls, around which the valleys of Hinnom and Josaphat curve, there is a unique, deep, and secret life weaving alongside the busy mundane. Strange, curious spirits dwell, reside, brood here and there. Their zest for life feeds on the profound magic of the location. Shuffling, mysterious footsteps at night from the Wailing Wall to the Street of Sorrows. Inside the forbidden city, the gates and walls of the Haram, there are gesturing figures, appearing superhuman in their adoration, cast down under the densely populated sky, Saint Elmo's fire on the tips of their hands, raised in ecstasy. A kind of person spellbound, looking eastward, from monasteries, synagogues, mosques, almost blissful like those in the graves under the Mount of Olives, in the graves of all cemeteries around the city walls, living in the holy place, liberated by faith from earthly woes. Madness, the madness of pilgrims, crusaders, builders of Zion, under the sober surface of each individual, the spark of eternal fire glows. In 1,000 little tasks of practical and quirky nature, in the pursuit and speculation about matters of archaeological, antiquarian, philosophical, folkloristic research, geology, zoology, countless specialized branches of human knowledge, the indivisible, profoundly mysterious connection of the individual with the ground, the magical cradle of human thought, is revealed. Look there at the blind, the countless blind, how they feel their way through the crowd with sticks leaning forward. Their faces don't reflect despair over the lost sense, the departed world. They are transfigured, for perhaps their darkness is a kind of purple, like the glow that often appears at sunset, in a tremendous burst of light, like the northern lights of the east, flaring up over the mountain ridge from which Jerusalem rises. The blind in the holy city are saints. Their infirmity blesses them. The madman, the leper in the holy city are blessed, sanctified by their affliction. Heavily loaded with sacks, perhaps filled with flour, perhaps with stones, small gray donkeys, driven by an Arab, slowly climb the road from Josaphat to the village of Shiloah. Slowly and with surrender, the burdened animals make their way. Their silver fur is so silvery, their delicate ears rosy on the inside. Their large, yellow-rimmed eyes look down at the sharp, hard stones. A call from the Arab, and they stop, not resting, patient and loyal, waiting for another call or a strike of the stick to tell them to move on. Without moving, gentle and silver, they stand in the bazaar, tied to the ring of a doorpost, as the bustling crowd brushes against them, steps on their thin, easily injured legs. Say a prayer if one comes to mind. If you pass by a little donkey, heavily laden, faithfully standing with its head bowed at the roadside. Up there, on the ridge of the Mount of Olives, a caravan of camels crosses the road, heading to Shechem, loaded with crates on either side of their humps, gently swaying with each step. They move along their path. They are beautifully shaped in the clear evening light. With soft steps, a melodic wavy line from their slender heads and necks to their tall, well-shaped legs, the noble animals ascend the rising road. They wear blue beaded necklaces around their necks to ward off the evil eye. The first in line, the leader, wears a turban on its head like a human. Behind, in a blue cloak and red headscarf, follows the Arab with a long shepherd's staff. And behind the last in line are three others in white and brown felt coats, their billowing yellow headdress pressed to their heads with a black horsehair band. One of the camels is too heavily burdened. Its hump twitches under the unbearable load. The crates sway badly on both sides. It raises its head, gazing at the sky with its shiny black eyes, turning its neck sharply to the right, then the left, letting out a lamenting cry like that of a person suffering unjustly. I heard a similar cry from a mad beggar woman sitting in her rags near Golgotha Hill, a few steps in front of the government house, waiting for alms on a piece of wall. Just one sound from both human and beast, then silence. A massive herd of goats is coming down from Scopus, moving past the Mufti's house. Following them are 3 Arabian riders. The goats have long, shaggy coats, either black or ochre-colored, with crimson-striped wool hanging down in strands from their backs to their bellies. Their heads are narrow, their ears covering half their heads, hanging in broad flaps down their necks. Laban's herds are descending from the hills of Samaria. There's not enough room on the road for all this abundance and wealth. Like a dark cloud, this pressing throng moves toward the gates of the holy city. Where have the birds gone? The blessed flocks of the heavens, the living clouds, envied and longed for, circling the firmament in the north, diving below the southern horizon? It's autumn. The sky should be filled with flocks of birds. They've left the icy lands. I scan the skies above the Mediterranean, in Egypt, along the Nile, and the edges of the Sahara near the pyramids, but I saw none of our birds. Where are the storks, the swallows, the millions of tiny cold bodies, the little arrows, the winged chatterers from the broad leafy tree in Hiddenso? An eagle, a few dark vultures circle slowly over the Mount of Olives. I saw no birds from the north during all the time I spent here in the south. None of the countless flocks that leave us in autumn, returning in spring. I saw them not over the desert, not over the mountains, not over the cities. Where do the birds fly when it turns cold and dark? In the evenings, as the sun sets behind the mountains of Judea, travelers walk the hard paths of the valleys, made of agate and onyx stone, ascending to the Mount of Olives. Here is Gethsemane, a well-kept garden with colorful flowers and ancient olive trees. And here, where a small chapel stands in a tiny garden, Jesus wept over the city. The steep path leads to the Russian monastery at the top of the Mount of Olives, with its tall tower offering views westward to Jerusalem and Judea and eastward to the Dead Sea, the Jordan, and the Moab Mountains. Here, as you climb with difficulty, weary and burdened with painful worries, reflect, weep, traveler, over the teachings, the death, the dying teachings, the futile death of the finest among the Jews. Weep over this world, where from a Jew came Christianity through compassion for the wretched, whereby his people, to whom he preached gentleness, justice, readiness to help the poorest and most rejected, a divinely glorious man bled to death on a rough cross. Not as the founder of a new faith did the Christ of the Christians fall, but as a proclaimer of a social law that threatened the people's baser instincts. Today, once again, the law and the teachings rise from among the best of the living, and it is to be crucified anew in the best of the living. Weep, weep if you still have tears over the nations of this world that united after murder, to rob, to plunder, to rob each other, to plunder each other. Look northward, where the Volga flows into the Caspian Sea, where blameless millions must starve so that the nations can steal better, plunder more thoroughly. Weep, if you can, over the lie of faith, the disgrace of humanity, over this existence in the present, over those who call this existence living. But now the Moab mountains melt into the blue like glaciers of sand in the evening glow. Extinct fissures, traces of crumbling rock descend towards the leaden mirror of the Dead Sea below. Distant worlds fade into unreality. The sky above your head shines in a wide arc of bright yellow, orange, violet, blue-reddish, chalice red. High above, an enormous, never-before-seen tent of transparent blood, magical and inexplicable for a brief moment before it turns to ash. Beautiful and terrible you are, sky, above the battlements of the holy city. A mystery, known only to God, is the light, the breath, the silence above Jerusalem. The small graves opposite the Haram wall, on the slope of the Mount of Olives above Josaphat, still glow like tiny phosphorescent lines. Then with one stroke, everything sinks, and the southern starry sky, intoxicating with myriads of unknown stars, unfolds immensely. A bell rings, another. The muezzin's sorrowful call rises and breaks at the highest note. From the village of Shiloah, the melancholic braying of donkeys can be heard. Up here it is already completely dark. A horizontal ray of light from a car speeding down the street darts through the darkness for miles. Down in the ancient city, now sunken, a few shy and rare lights can be seen. Little light shines from narrow windows, curtained as the night falls. Beyond the ramparts, the ancient walls, outside the western gates of the city, the Jaffa Gate, the Damascus Gate, there's a belt of life, vibrant and contemporary. Broad roads extend outwards and across towards the west, northwest, leading to the hills of Judea, the roads of Samaria. New houses are here, built in modern styles, for better or worse, with apartment blocks, business streets, villas of wealthy Arabs and Jews, a bustle of streets crisscrossing over hills and valleys, with individual complexes of buildings set on bare rock. Despite the last pope's encyclical against the city outside the gates of Holy Jerusalem, the life of the new era can't be banished from these streets. The drive of life barely holds back from desecrating the holy precincts. The noise of carriages and automobiles clatters through streets and alleys. Dance halls and bars exist in the new city. Drunken British soldiers holler through the night. Across from a monastery garden, a cinema has opened, with brass music blaring from the balcony. On Jaffa Street, locals and foreigners haggle and trade. People of all nations, all faiths. Dubious Levantine civilization thrives. The cosmopolitan belt spreads inexorably around the core of old sacred Zion. The Street of 100 Gates, Mea Shearim, opens its portals to the sprawling ghetto of the Kollels, the Hungarian, Transylvanian, Romanian, Bessarabian, Polish Chalukha people. From massive courtyards inhabited by dozens of families, from endless narrow row houses, from hundreds and hundreds of gates, the ghetto life streams and streams out. Each kollel has transplanted its home exile, with its customs and vices, faithfully here to the ancient land. Beyond, on the hillside, stretches the stone quarter of the Bukharan colony. Before the war, it was the wealthiest of the kollel communities. Now, like that of Mea Shearim, it has become impoverished, its residents surviving through 1,000 small ghetto jobs, trade, and crafts. On a Friday evening walk, a stranger finds the most astonishing and surprising variety of synagogues, prayer rooms, rituals, and sects in these Jewish quarters. Behind hundreds of glowing windows, there is singing, prayer rises, choirs resound, endless variations in ritual forms, customs, in the architectural style of the rooms, in the clothing of the worshippers. The Bukharans in their colorful oriental silk robes, the Damascenes, Aleppines, Beirutis, Sephardim, Moroccans, Yemenites, wearing fezes like Turks, their prayer rooms resembling mosques, large halls covered with splendid carpets, with a divan along the walls, deep shelves with holy volumes lined spine to spine. The Ashkenazim, Hasidim in black, blue, or red velvet kaftans with fur-trimmed wide slakses and hats on their long, curl-locked, wild, bearded heads, ecstatic, suddenly falling into chaotic shouting, gesturing around the platform that rises in the middle of the room, on which a tall figure entirely covered by a shroud sends incantatory calls to the eternal. Silver objects, candlesticks, Torah holders, richly embroidered curtains with gold ornaments, fruits, vines cascading before the Holy of Holies. Once, in the house of a wealthy person, there were two synagogues, one for the owner, his friends, the scholars, the other for anyone who came by, pilgrims, the devout, beggars, the weary. They were true chapels, like in the houses of princes, powerful men of the earth, large rooms adorned with precious carpets, equipped with libraries of carefully written sacred books. Now all this only belongs to the memory of a bygone world, a completed era, the likes of which will never dawn again. Indeed, endless gradations of customs, habits, prejudices, dogmas, and delusions separate quarter from quarter, street from street, even house from house. Sects upon sects dwell here in the ghetto, outside the gates of the holy city, all drawn by the common magnet on the fortress of Zion, on the Mount of David, yet internally irreconcilably split and fragmented. Fanatics, small-minded, hate-filled know-it-alls, unified only in their common disdain for the custom-defying, unclean-eating, Sabbath-driving, smoking, freely wandering Shaluts who has cut off their golden source. How many people live in Mea Shearim, the Bukharan colony, Nachlat Shiva, and the Montefiore houses? No one knows. You can read in the Bible that taking a census is a sin punished by plagues. When gathering enough people for evening prayers, they count like this: not one, not two, not three. This vague, ungraspable, undefined, countless mass of people is supposed to form a nation. When deeply religious Mizrahim meet Reform Jews, renewal often leads to terrible, wild scenes on the streets inside and outside the ghetto, dangerous clashes. Do not dare to walk in the rain with an umbrella on the Sabbath. Do not show yourself with your wife arm in arm, or even walking beside her in Mea Shearim. Blasphemy. Yet sometimes touching, surprising events occur that break down ancient walls of division, resolving misunderstandings suddenly, in an instant. During the last pogrom in November, the main self-defense group was in a small Ashkenazi synagogue in Jerusalem's Old City. The brave young pioneers were there with their weapons, responding to danger signals, bringing the wounded and dying there, lodging the dead. Courageous Jewish girls brought weapons and new ammunition in soup tureens, food containers. During prayer hours, the devout risked their lives to reach the synagogue, now turned military base, yet some turned away seeing the desecration. Men without head coverings, women in the Torah room, people eating on stretchers, the wounded, corpses on straw. But among the devout elders, some were wiser. Standing and crying at the entrance, they approached their armed young brothers, and one said, "You have fulfilled one commandment, protecting our people's lives. Won't you fulfill a second, finally putting on the prayer straps and praying as is proper? Won't you do it for the eternal?" A new large residential area for Jerusalem's Jewish community is being established. The Zionist Commission has acquired an extensive tract of land on the Greek Patriarchate's property, stretching from Jaffa Street down to the Monastery of the Cross. Jews from the dangerous Old City will be settled there. A Jewish market, office buildings, schools, villa streets, and residential areas will arise. Living together in large settlements, Jews can better protect themselves from external enemies threatening their existence. But against the internal enemy dwelling in Mea Shearim, the spirit of intolerance and discord, only a third temple built in spirit can protect. Tel Aviv, the Spring Hill, is the first purely Jewish city in Palestine and the world. A city with only a single weekly holiday, the one beginning on Friday evening. It is a suburb of Jaffa, built a few kilometers north of the port by the shore, a villa city extending from the railway embankment and orange groves to the sea, tearing up dunes, climbing dunes, broad, well-planned, splendidly developed avenues, magnificent houses surrounded by well-kept gardens. In its beautiful settings, young men and women in the new fashionable clothes stroll around. The dialect from Odessa dominates the city. More Russian than Hebrew is heard. Piano music sounds from the villa floors. The gymnasium on Herzl Street has a hall for concerts, recitation evenings. There are cinemas. People dance, flirt abundantly. The rainy season is called the season. The city has been given malicious nicknames: the Grunewald of Palestine, Heringsdorf, the resort for wealthy Jews. The pioneer arriving in Jaffa gets his first impression of the land of his longing. He sees the aristocrats, the patricians, the wealthy bourgeoisies in their villas, with their silk-clad wives, in the cloud of their abundant gossip. The pioneer takes off his cap, first stands in awe, then composes himself and remarks, "Here live our rich. It's a pity we're hungry. I'd like to live in a house with 8 rooms too, playing the piano instead of sharing a tent with 4, and having jackals dance around my bed every night for weeks." He rushes excitedly between the railway embankment and the gymnasium, up and down Herzl Street, Lillian Bloom Street, Allenby Avenue, familiar with the offices, the Histadrut, the immigration office, and the House of the Pioneers. He knows all those little wild cafes and food stands and knows exactly how much credit he'll get at each one. But he's unsure when he'll reach the point of living in an 8-room house, having a bank account, and hiring Arabs to work in his orange groves. To be fair, it must be noted that there are very few who are considered wealthy bourgeois in Tel Aviv. There are some, sure, and when the pioneering worker is hungry, he walks past their windows, feeling bitter and resentful, keeping his thoughts to himself. But the overwhelming majority in Tel Aviv are the likes of civil servants, teachers, doctors, and architects. Everyone depends on one another, much like in the ghetto of Mea Shearim. They rely on each other in this elevated ghetto. Without connections to the Arab surroundings, they're developing in their own world, thriving through economic isolation. Just a year ago, life in Tel Aviv flowed in orderly and moderate rhythms. The turning point came with the May riots in Jaffa, after which the Jews from the old city across the coast rushed into the Jewish city of Tel Aviv, where you can still see them living in hastily constructed barracks. Settling the displaced and endangered Jewish residents of Jaffa in Tel Aviv accelerated building activity, invigorated life, and boosted Tel Aviv's traffic. The newly forming district on Jaffa Street near Jerusalem will experience the same development when, after being planned and designed according to the best modern urban models, commercial streets, bazaars, avenues, and villa quarters arise there for the benefit of pioneers and Arabs, Jews, and Christians. Currently, houses, villas, and entire neighborhoods are springing up like mushrooms between the railway embankment and the beach, between the silica factory and the Neve Tzedek district, which borders Jaffa and was the scene of those furious riots in May. Pioneers come and go between the unfinished houses, wading through the deep sand of unpaved avenues, pushing carts with bricks, mixing lime, and raising scaffolding. Little houses appear overnight, thin and with walls that could be blown away, with stairs you wouldn't send a cat up. These ramshackle houses, barely born, doomed to death from the start along with their residents. The homes of the affluent, built from good materials, are solid and stately, while those of small craftsmen and the lower semi-proletariat are quickly thrown together with inadequate foundations, cracks in the floor, and barely dried perimeter walls. A gust of wind can take the roof off such a home, and a downpour might soak it into the basement. The carelessness with which these neighborhoods are built is astonishing, insufficient, dangerous, aiming just to give the appearance of completion. I walk, stunned, through the uneven sandy paths between a group of such new houses, which a bank company is having a Hungarian builder construct for its employees. One of these card houses is already finished. The windows are in place, the doorstep painted, and the roof actually sits on the floor. The sand at my feet is littered with discarded building equipment, valuable tools, bricks, metal pieces, and pipe fragments. Deafening noise comes from inside the closed little house. Are these the owners, the residents, celebrating joyfully inside because they finally have a roof over their heads? Quietly and discreetly, I sneak up to a ground floor window and peer through the glass. Inside, 6 pioneers in mortar-splattered smocks and hats askew on their heads are singing, holding each other's shoulders, and dancing a wildly berserk victory dance, a frenzied rikutel in honor of their successful work. With the silent wish that the ground of Tel Aviv, the hill of spring, may not open up under their stomping and swallow them all, these builders of the land of Israel, I step away from the window and vanish towards the tent camp by the beach. It's bursting with those enthusiastic crowds, the newly arrived, less welcome builders of the land of Israel, anxiously watching the Mediterranean horizon, wondering if another ship with enthusiastic crowds of newcomers is approaching. On the summit of the Mount of Olives, from where one can see the Holy City and simultaneously the Dead Sea, stands a German consulate. A German-built structure tries to look Romanesque, with its German-style tower and roof. It's solid and grand, featuring excellent bathroom facilities. This building once bore a bronze statue of Wilhelm the Crusader and is named after Empress Augusta Victoria. Currently, it serves as the office of the British High Commissioner, Sir Herbert Samuel. Surrounded by this grandeur, the head of the Palestinian government lives between the Holy City and the Dead Sea, always looking westward towards London, the capital of the Orient. I visited Sir Samuel and had an audience with him. The scenery on the way to his house is breathtaking. Rock tombs in the El Jos riverbed on the right, the Jordan River's mouth, the Dead Sea, the Judean desert, and the bluish-pink Moab Mountains on the left. Throughout the journey, one looks forward to finishing the formalities and enjoying these views on the way back. Sir Samuel is an exceptionally distinguished and kind person, apparently very good-hearted. He is also devout, praying on Saturdays, and when in the city, he wears the traditional sect's death shroud depending on the synagogue he visits. I heard his wife speak Hebrew at a significant official event, a reception for the American Zionist doctors' organization, Hadassah. Friends assured me that Lady Samuel's Hebrew sounded authentic. Whenever the text mentioned Palestine, she referred to it as Eretz Israel. Before my audience, I spent time traveling around Galilee, filled with what I saw and felt. I tried to find out if Samuel had any idea about the happenings in Galilee among the young settlers. I talked about the shalutzim, their struggles, beliefs, sacrifices, and the dangers they face. I emphasized the need to protect them and their spirit. Samuel let me speak and then replied kindly with typical, machine-like responses resembling what I had heard elsewhere from various officials. Tact towards the Arabs was emphasized, with the notion that Jewish tact would ease relations. He mentioned adjusting the Galilean gendarmerie to include 1/3 Jews and also stationed Circassians there, mountain Jews. It seemed he had no real understanding of the Shaluts. His perception of their lives and motivations seemed as foreign to him as it would be to any ordinary Christian. I sensed that the thought of 40 young men and 4 young women living together in roadside tents was as uncomfortable for him as it would be for any Englishman accustomed to a life centered around tea and breakfast of eggs and bacon, followed by bridge with dinner in a tuxedo. I assured him on my honor not to publish his words as an interview in my newspaper. It was easy to promise this, given that he hadn't said anything substantial during our meeting. Essentially, Sir Herbert seems like a typical English bureaucrat, correct, dutiful, and reliable. He's known to genuinely support the Jewish cause within the constraints set by both his superiors and his own nature. He aims to manage immigration in a manner acceptable to both World Jewry and the Zionist Commission, while also meeting the approval of his London overseers. He advocates land purchases to help the Jews establish themselves. But where was he when 3 poor Jews were sentenced just for being caught up in the chaos during the last Jerusalem pogrom, from which a bomb had been thrown? Arbitrarily selected, these 3 were pulled from the crowd and imprisoned, even though a bomb was also thrown by the Arabs into the yeshiva, the Holitscher house in the Old City. These dreadful incidents were dismissed as being not so important, merely exaggerated disturbances. Disturbances? Were they really just disturbances? From the point of view of London, it might be, much like how the Vatican, in such events, may see nothing more than regrettable disturbances caused by Jews disrupting the holy peace of Christ's city. Regardless, the top English official is obliged to skillfully and sensitively navigate between English liberalism and Palestinian Judaism. Sir Herbert faces a challenging role. I can hardly think of a political position more difficult in the world, even compared to the Viceroy of India, which is also held by an English Jew, Lord Reading, known as Rufus Isaacs. No mere official, no matter how skilled, wise, tactful, and experienced, would suffice to fill the top government position in Palestine. A new Moses is needed, a grand leader with halos shining upwards from his forehead to the heavens, not someone donned in a ceremonial uniform with a tropical helmet and a golden saber. Perhaps it was a mistake to entrust the top governmental role in Palestine to a Jew. When the military administration was replaced by a civilian one in July 1920, a Christian friendly to Zionism might have been found among the capable, experienced, and diplomatic senior officials of England for this position. There are many such individuals in England. The noblest among the Christians of the Anglo-Saxon race have always understood and loved the idea of Zion. Palmerston, Byron, Shelley, Moore, Arthur Balfour. Just as, out of a sense of justice, empathy for the oppressed, and outrage against tyrants, there were Philhellenes, pro-Sinn Feiners, followers of Gandhi, and supporters of Soviet Russia among the most distinguished and best of English society. The Jewish people surely have many influential and energetic friends among the English. Sending a Jew as High Commissioner to Palestine was a historic gesture. It has neither strengthened nor adequately adorned England's policy. Christians in Palestine and elsewhere, and Arabs respond to this English gesture with another, rather unveiled fist-shaking. Sending a Jew here, to the city of our Savior, an English Presbyterian in Jerusalem told me, felt like a slap in the face to us Christians. Does Christ have to be crucified a second time here? Meanwhile, in Alcantara, on the Suez Canal, a station Tommy gave a telling response to a well-known lady who asked if he liked his post. He would rather be at home in Tipperary than guarding the railway that the English built and a Jew now owns. The Arabs are equally unhappy about the Jewish High Commissioner. That spear in Beit Shean, hurled by an Arab at the lofty anointed Jewish head, came from one of the Haifa clubs, where Arab nationalism plays footsie with the Vatican-supported French-Syrian power politics, overshooting its target. It's also clear that in the British Parliament, both the Commons and the Lords, there has been an overt anti-Semitic movement only since the Balfour Declaration. And in Jerusalem, an anti-Zionist governor, the much-opposed and despised half-Levantine Englishman Storrs, is allowed to conduct his distinctly Christian policy. Fundamentally, when England speaks of Palestine, it means the Suez Canal and not the national home for the Jews. It also means the road leading from London to Mesopotamia. England deals with tangible assets when favoring the Jews, and with the same when prioritizing Arab interests to neutralize the dangerous ambitions of elusive forces seeping in from Tehran across the Jordan and the vast wave of Gandhi from the south over Aden moving northward. England has little concern for Zionism. The Chalutz harbors no illusions regarding the sentiments of the English authority. Once, I witnessed something symbolic unfold before my eyes. One Saturday afternoon, while engaged in stimulating conversation with Bulgarian, German, and Russian comrades in that Quish group by the Haifa-Gemma road, we suddenly heard the deafening clatter of a stopping motor from below by the shore. Some of our group jumped up, ran outside the barracks. They quickly shouted to us inside, "Come on!" Down below, on their half-finished road, a large automobile had gotten stuck among the sharp stones. The chauffeur and two soldiers jumped out of the car and began to shove the stones away with their hands from the front wheels. "They're wrecking our road," someone shouted next to me. "Run down, get the car's number." In no time, a giant, broad-shouldered worker took massive strides down the street, passionately trying to talk to the soldiers. They, however, ignored him as if he wasn't there and continued to shove aside the carefully laid stones of the road. An English general got out of the car, gold braid, khaki uniform, colorful medals, monocle, riding crop. He also paid no mind to our comrade, who was so loudly trying to reason with them that we could hear him from where we stood on the hill. 3 or 4 others ran down with him, trying to defend their road. In front of the car, a deep hole gaped. The chauffeur cranked the engine. The general and soldiers hurriedly got back in the car. The big, bear-like worker stood in front of the car, arms spread. "Stop!" The car drove forward. With a monstrous clattering, it lurched into the hole, picked up speed, and charged straight at the worker. Without swerving, without veering an inch from its path, it drove directly at the man standing there with open arms, defending his work. If the worker had not leapt aside in the very last fraction of a split second, the general's car would have run him over without changing course. We looked at each other in front of the barrack. We understood each other without exchanging a word. There are dissatisfied folks in Palestine who talk about the lack of backbone, timidity, and even political incompetence of the Palestinian Zionist Authority, When, during negotiations with the British, another failure befalls the Jewish community, like back then with the funding of Arab schools but not Jewish ones. More recently, the distribution of good, fertile, and strategically important government land from old Sultan ownership in the Jezreel Valley went to nomadic Bedouin families instead of former Jewish legionnaires, as was originally planned and semi-promised. This setback is a severe loss for the Zionist cause, both morally and materially. The land is excellent. The scattered Jewish settlements in the valley are now very endangered by their new neighbors. The disregard for the Jewish legionnaires has left a deep discontent. These types of episodes keep happening. From the perspective of Palestine, England's policy in the Orient has become oddly unstable, uncertain, and contradictory. Neither Jews nor Arabs can make sense of it or trust it. Jewish efforts suffer from this unpredictability. The tension grows between races, communities, and religions. There's discomfort and constant irritation. Last year, Sir Samuel convened a rabbinical assembly in Jerusalem with representatives from various streams, sort of a synedrion, and opened it with emphatic ceremony. The idea seemed to be that the British wanted to establish a type of spiritual authority for Judaism in Palestine. Right now, there's a secular middle authority between the British government and the Jews of Palestine, a national council, with 3 members chaired by Dr. Jacob Tahn. Its members include David Yellen, the deputy mayor of Jerusalem, and Ben Zvi, one of the leaders of Palestinian socialists. It's a secular political representation for the Jews. From what I've heard, it has little influence over the government's decisions. Its role is more informational. When the question arose on who should succeed the Turks in Palestine and which of the local nationalities or religious communities should take charge, there was talk initially of internationalizing the land and then of a condominium of 2 powers. For the Jews, it was preferable for England to hold authority over Palestine because they were sympathetic to Jewish matters and had the important ability to colonize, albeit through questionable methods. To this day, the question of whether England will receive the mandate over Palestine or remain a protective power is unresolved. It's worth noting that this question is only of temporary significance. With the fall of imperialism, the problem of colonization will also vanish. The ability of imperialistically governed nations to hold and maintain colonies is dwindling and will soon be entirely obsolete. The Jewish people in Palestine are not aiming to create a Jewish state, but rather a Jewish autonomy that could eventually grow into a Jewish Palestine. However, as I must reiterate, the unclear nature of England's Middle Eastern policies is significantly hindering their structured development and potential for a peaceful growth, just as they are heavily hampered by severe financial shortages in their basic activities like immigration and colonization. There are pessimists who are already exploring the idea of a future English-French conflict in Palestine. Others, with even gloomier views, predict a massive uprising of Eastern nations against the most advanced outpost of European culture, the Palestinian Jewish community, which they foresee being overrun and left behind. Whenever I felt overwhelmed by the challenges, dangers, and the Herculean effort required in Palestine, I recalled an old Talmudic legend. Shipwrecked individuals find refuge on a barren island in the middle of the sea. The ground is hard rock, with sparse tufts of moss here and there. The struggling settlers start their lives and work as best they can. After extended struggles with the land, as they build a fire to keep warm, the island suddenly begins to move and floats away with them. The island was the back of a fish. This legend came to mind as I observed the life and labor of Jews in Palestine. But is the departing fish Palestine? It is, in fact, the entire modern world. About a year ago, Winston Churchill, during a speech in Jerusalem, shared something interesting. There are 3 tendencies in today's Jewish community: conservatism, Zionism, and Bolshevism. England wishes to use the first 2 to effectively counter the last. Colleagues with radical views told me, the Jewish world bourgeoisie is preparing Palestine as their future home. Under the protection and in the service of English capitalist imperialism, the pioneers, unaware, are temporarily being used only to be cast aside later by the Jewish world bourgeoisie. All this might sound excessively exaggerated, both in thought and expression. Perhaps both the English imperialism and the Jewish world bourgeoisie are mistaken if they are attempting to manipulate the pioneers for any hidden objectives. Perhaps the contentious third trend in Judaism will eventually consume English imperialism and the Jewish bourgeoisie, along with all the so-called wise and mighty of this era. A period that defies simple arithmetic and is not as straightforward as they have calculated it to be. What is certain is that none of the active socialists, those who have understood the necessity of real action in our times, are headed for Palestine. Europe and America remain the central arenas for the decisive class struggles of the future. Those Borochaus, ardent followers of the Third International, are in the shadows, forming cells. They await the spreading, strengthening, and overwhelming of world capitalism and the assimilation of the working masses into a united proletariat, ready to act when history draws the Orient, including Palestine, into its current. It is hard to grasp how one can be a Zionist and not go to Palestine. If you are a Zionist, your place is not in Europe nor in America, but solely in Palestine. Zionists in the diaspora sometimes remind me of members of a scientific society or a club of amateurs planning a South Pole expedition. Those returning from Palestine are often surprised by the endless discussions, writings, and fantasies revolving around the core issue of Zionism, the life and work of settlers in Palestine. Zionism has gradually become a playground for literary exercises, organizational obsession, and club activities. The social, political, and non-political parties within diaspora Judaism engage and clash here, bringing various conflicts to a head. The astonishing diversity of issues surrounding the idea of Palestine startled and baffled many at the Carlsbad Zionist Congress. Yet Zionism remains so simple, natural, and crystal clear when witnessed in action on site. Work, faith, risk, and sacrifice. Zionism in the diaspora is justified only by the positive and immediate service it can provide to those working, believing, risking, and sacrificing for the greater cause between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River. About a year and a half ago, I had discussions with some Jewish commissars in the Moscow Kremlin regarding Zionism and how the Bolsheviks position themselves towards Zionists still in Russia and those who have emigrated to Palestine. One of the most insightful and articulate of these commissars revealed to me that it wasn't just nationalism they held against the Zionists. It was also because so many strong and devoted individuals, who essentially sought the same goals for which Russia was struggling with the world, were voluntarily removing themselves from the action, staying far from where the key movements were happening, those movements on which they depended and from which they would eventually benefit. This led to a significant loss of valuable, necessary strength for Russia. In Palestine, I've encountered a similar, quietly rooted doubt, even among those most dedicated to the cause. There's a question of whether so much energy is wasted on insurmountable obstacles, and whether it wouldn't be better, more intense, and more effective in Europe, at the center of the big events. While official Palestine relies on the balance of the great powers and their Middle Eastern policies, the socialist movement in Palestine relies solely on the ongoing economic and social transformation currently taking place in Europe and America. There is no doubt that only a large social upheaval like the one the Third International aims for can end the dangerous and fateful conflict between Arabs, Jews, and Christians, along with the defeat of global imperialism, which stands behind these conflicts, fueling and utilizing them. Under Soviet rule, the age-old wars between Tatars, Georgians, Bukharians, and Armenians suddenly stopped. Socialism is the sole path to resolving and ending nationalistic feuds. Of course, the peoples of the East are still far from socialism. Above the global political developments and social connections, there stands the grand utopian idea of a new humanity, currently stirring in Palestine within souls that have little connection to the active global processes of this time. This idea, realized in life and reality here, could potentially exert its mystical influence on those global processes. The religious socialism in Palestine is timeless, not bound by temporal measures. One of the typical questions heard repeatedly in Palestine from non-Jews is, why are Jews so excited? Why are the Jews so agitated? What is this eternally excited, eternally restless, eternally dissatisfied race? The The Jews are told, "You are making too much noise about Palestine in the world. You probably must do so to obtain funds for the country, but you mustn't because the Arabs are irritated and troubled by this constant noise." In some ways, this accusation is correct. It's very Jewish. Everything must be achieved at once. Jewish middle-class folks should be re-educated into farmers in possibly 3 months. The executive should function perfectly overnight. The obstacles are enormous, granted. But why isn't it running like clockwork, this executive? Why does it waver, like the British government, between Jews and Arabs, between the radicals and the Orthodox, the Gdud and the Mizrahi? Why is the center of the executive so weak between the extremes? Very Jewish. After 2,000 years of oppression, the glory of action, the exertion of strength, and asserting one's own authority in the world should appear overnight. The utopia becoming reality without delay. Indeed, Palestine is a heated, overstimulated country, filled to the brim with the highest intelligence, enthusiasm, fervor of faith and willpower, and the tension of spirits. It often feels as if the accumulated, compressed energy of the race is on the verge of exploding the small country like dynamite. Overzealous sense of responsibility, but also narrow-minded fanaticism sometimes clash. A young person comes to my mind. He came to me in Tel Aviv. Like most who settle in Palestine, he adopted a Hebrew paternal name, having discarded and forgotten his European one along with his doctorate title. He belonged to the most radical group, the Hashomer Hatzair, which is now headed to Nuris. I spoke with him about Landauer, Eisner, Levine, Trotsky, Luxemburg. He exclaimed, "Traitors, lost souls who've abandoned their own people." He went on, "Arrogant, proud Jews who dare to think they can lead everyone." But deep down, he believed Trotsky, Landauer, and Luxemburg were too noble to lead a mixed crowd of Jews, Christians, and pagans. What was needed today, he thought, was for every Jew to fight and die for Judaism. No one has the right to decide if these people might have been better off using their strength in Europe instead of emigrating to the rocky ancestral land of Palestine. Palestine proves that the purest will for religious communism exists in today's world. If I had returned from Russia a year ago with doubts about communism, Palestine would have restored my certainty. The idea is alive. All classes of civilized world Jewry work towards this cultural ideal of Zion, unconsciously supported by the most capitalistic American financiers who resist communism, and consciously by the proletarianizing pioneers in the plains and mountains of Eretz Israel. The courage of this small, selected group, the biblical little flock mentioned in the Gospel of John, reflects back on the Jewish people scattered in the diaspora. Just as the spirit of French humanists and German philosophers once did, and now Moscow's spirit shines back on the world, unleashing and elevating forces. But it's not just that which is brewing, foggy, uncertain, and eerie in today's Palestine. It's not just that. Often while walking the agate and onyx paths leading up to the Mount of Olives, often in the valley of Josaphat, on the bridge over Gehenna, or at the quiet shores of Lake Tiberias, or in a tent, a shack in the wilderness, on steep ridges or by the road, in tents and shacks echoing with the cheerful noise of Friday evening, I was suddenly overcome by a cold shiver, a horror, a sense of something great and otherworldly. In prophetic books and songs, in the scriptures, which more people and more serious minds study today than ever before, there's talk of a class of martyrs, a group of Israelites in flesh and spirit standing guard at the threshold of a new era. The new era is the kingdom of the one who is to come. And this group, this class of Israelites, will make the threshold redder with their blood than the sunrise ever was over him who rode a silver donkey through the gate of the holy city, over him who galloped into the city with a bright turban on a snow-white horse through the eastern gate. A sacrificial death is said to prepare the kingdom of that one whose coming prophetic words announce, prepared now as always by the lives and deaths of the noblest, in whom the spark glows brightest. The ancient and new paradise of brotherhood, compassion, justice, and Jewish-Christian communism glows on the eastern horizon, casting its mirage over the visible world, which loses its brilliance. The bearers of the ancient, new, eternal law, the splendid young Jews of Palestine, stand with plow and gun in strong hands, love and justice on their brows, at the threshold of a new, terrifying era. Are they to be the martyr class, the noble group to bring the sacrifice? Is this the deep, inexplicable, metaphysical cause that calls a people to the spot on the globe where their destiny shall be fulfilled? Is this the cause of the urge, the torrent, the pent-up, halting, and then surging, unstoppable movement of the best, purest, chosen ones towards Eretz Israel? Have faith, little flock. God is with you. In the old holy city, not far from where the temple once stood, lies nestled in ruins a small pool, the Pool of Bethesda, now called Birkat Israin, Pool of Israel. Its surface is clear, the water is still. Where does it come from? An underground spring feeds the small pool, holds the water between the ruins, neither rising nor falling, always maintaining the same level. The surface is clear. But now and then the small pool is seized by an unexplained movement. Its water foams, waves rise, beating stormily against the walls that encase it. Then cripples of all kinds, the blind, the lame, the wretched from all over the city rush over, pressing into the ruins with tears and cries. The angel has touched the water. Cripples, the sick and the unfortunate step into the pool's water, which suddenly gains healing powers. They descend into the water and emerge healed. The miracle of faith, the angel himself has touched them. The pool of Israel has healed them. Today's Jewish Palestine is like such a pool of Israel, like a Bethesda pool, fed by an underground, mysterious source. It lay quiet for a long time. Now an angel has stirred it. May the Jewish community of the world step into this stirred, angel-touched pool and find healing there.